Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, so we will make a start if that's okay. I'm just going to do introductions shortly, but we'll do firstly housekeeping. So welcome to the Communities and Environment Scrutiny Panel. Fire alarm is not expected. If the alarm sounds, can all present leave the building as quickly as possible by the way of the nearest exit. The designated assembly point is in the public square in front of CAS, beyond the fountain, away from the civic office. No roll call will be undertaken. If there is any...
Sorry, Chair,
yeah.
I can't hear through my headphones. Are you speaking through the mic?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Is that working? Can you hear me now?
Let me try again.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you.
Great. If there is anybody with mobility issues, please wait in the refuge area at the top of the stairs where the emergency evacuation lift is located, using the intercom situated on the left-hand side of the lift doors to call for assistance. Can I ask for mobile phones to be switched to silent mode, please, if anyone has them? And this meeting will be audio-visually recorded and will be available to view on the Council's website and YouTube channel. So can I ask all those present to use their microphones to ensure audio can be captured? So that's press for those who are new to the meeting. It's pressing the red button, the large red button at the bottom of your screen once. It should come up red, as you can see here. And when you finish speaking, please do turn it off because it impacts the audio. Any members of the public entering the council chamber are accepting that their images will be retained and broadcast by the council. If there are any public in attendance, attending, we are intending to record or film any part of today's meeting, so please ensure that do not disturb the conduct of this meeting. Okay, so we'll start the agenda and then we'll do the introductions. So have we got any apologies for absence? Okay, so we'll do introductions then for our side. So I'm Gemma Cobby, the Chair for Communities Environment and also Councillor for Town Ward.
I'm James Church, Councillor for the Bentley Ward.
Councillor Rob Dennis for Town Ward.
Councillor David Nevitt for Edenthorpe and Kirksandall Ward.
Councillor Debbie Hutchinson, Adwick and Carcroft Ward.
Councillor Emma Muddyman-Rawlins for Wheatley Hills, Intake and Clay Lane Ward.
Jonathan Preston, Unison.
Councillor Thomas Noon, Norton and Ascombe Ward.
Amber Torrington, Governance Officer, taking the minutes.
Ian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Councillor Ian Pearson, coming from Denby Ward. Do it again, Ian. Councillor Ian Pearson for Cunningham and Denby Ward. Thank you.
Dan Swain, Executive Director at Place, Doncaster City Council.
Adam Porter, Flood Risk Manager, City of Doncaster Council.
Dan Wheatman, Resilience and Emergency Planning Manager at Doncaster Council.
Phil Maron, Street Works and Highway Network Manager for Doncaster Council. I'll be assuming the Head of Service for Highways and Infrastructure from the 1st of September.
Ben Brass, Senior Flood Risk and Advisor at the Environment Agency.
Vicky Townend, South Yorkshire Operations Manager, Environment Agency.
My name is Adam Ashman. I'm Head of Strategic Planning at Yorkshire Water.
Sarah Robinson, Corporate Affairs Advisor at Yorkshire Water.
Andrew McGill, CEO of Doncaster East IDB.
Chris McGuinness, Chairman Doncaster East IDB.
Thank you. Robert might suggest if you move to a microphone which has got one of these, or it's working, so we can hear you when we do the presentations later. Okay, thank you for the introductions. There are no issues on the agenda that should be excluded from the meeting for public and press, so I'll move on to declarations of interest. If anyone on the panel, yes, have you got one? Councillor David.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor David Nevitt, I sit on the Dagenham Drainage Board.
Thank you. If you're okay to, you've declared this now, so if you fill out a form with Amber after the meeting, and anyone else who has a declaration of interest, please do fill out a form with Amber after the meeting. Okay, moving on to the next agenda point. Minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of February should be in your packs for those on the panel from last year. Do you agree the minutes? Accept minutes? Yep. Thank you. And seconded? Okay, thank you. Public statements. Have we got any public statements? Okay, thank you. And we have got any reports where the public and press may not be excluded? I don't think we do. No. Okay, so that nicely moves on to the presentations from partners who are with us today. So we have a specific order. So we'll go through the City of Doncaster Council first, followed by the Environmental Agency, then the Internal Drainage Board, and then the Yorkshire Water. Okay. So if I move nicely on to the City of Doncaster Council to do the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Okay. Thank you. So I'm pleased to present, in partnership with other risk management authorities, details of the work which has taken place since 2019 floods. One of the biggest challenges we face is how fragmented flood risk management is across various risk management authorities. As water does not obey these administrative boundaries, partnership working is key to protecting our communities. So the image on the screen highlights the various types of flood risk and who are responsible for each. Just like to cover some of those. So property owners are responsible for private drainage up to the curtilage of their properties. The highway authorities are responsible for gullies and highway drains within the adopted roads. And the water authorities are responsible for the public sewers. The Environment Agency is responsible for managing the risk of flooding from main rivers, whilst ordinary watercourses are the responsibility of riparian owners, which is the two adjacent landowners. The IDBs are responsible for the enforcement and consenting works on these ordinary watercourses within their districts, while lead local flood authorities are responsible for the areas outside the IDB districts. So this slide covers the impacts of the 2019 floods and our comprehensive investigations and report, which aim to meet the statutory requirements of Section 19 of the Floods and Water Management Act 2010. And Doncaster Council's local flood risk management strategy by identifying the conditions, causes and sources that led to flooding and identifying the impacts of the flooding. So the report identifies responsibilities of risk management authorities in relation to the response and management of flood risk from various sources, engages with risk management authorities and communities affected, and provides opportunities for collaborative work with partner organisations. It assesses the performance and limitations of existing flood infrastructure during the flooding event and provides guidance to assist local residents, councillors, stakeholders, agencies, designers and planners on understanding the risks to and from the area and how to take measures to increase the resilience and preparedness. An outcome of this report is to identify assets for Doncaster City of Doncaster Council's flood risk register, identify updates required to our local flood risk management strategy and action plan, and establish and provide lessons learned and site-specific and strategic recommendations on flood risk management and mitigation, including the appropriateness of each of these measures. So, following the event, a number of improvements to our internal processes were implemented, including expanding the flood risk team to enhance our operational capabilities, but also to align with strategic goals and to reflect our increased responsibilities within the Floods and Water Management Act. There are now defined highway and land drainage teams and a flood risk team. Enhancements to our emergency response include the introduction of visual technology, update to the Doncaster multi-agency flood plan, setting up multi-agency pumping cells during flooding events, supporting communities to develop community flood plans, and provide command and control training and tours to flood risk hotspots for leadership. In addition to the regular community meetings we attend alongside members, we prepared a guide to promote awareness and resilience for residents and businesses throughout Doncaster. So the guide attached highlights Doncaster's flood risk, who is responsible and can provide assistance, our key infrastructure and community-specific risks, and how residents can prepare and act during these events. So following the 2019 floods, we updated our local flood risk management strategy. The Floods and Water Management Act 2010 requires lead local flood authorities to prepare and maintain a strategy for flood risk management within their areas, coordinating views and activity with other local bodies and communities through public consultation and scrutiny, and deliver planning. They must consult risk management authorities and the public about their strategy. So there was a need to update our existing strategy to reflect the changes in the flood risk landscape, capturing information from the 2019 flood event and subsequent near misses, to observe and update the national policy and climate change adaptation, and to present new action plan to renew our commitment to flood risk management. So the government's National Flood and Coastal Risk Management Strategy for England has three main ambitions: for climate resilient places, today's growth and infrastructure resilient in tomorrow's climate, and a nation ready to respond and adapt to climate change. Our local flood risk management strategy has 5 aims to support this national strategy: continually improve our understanding of flood risk within Doncaster, promote flood risk management schemes, work in partnership with other risk management authorities, and to encourage flood resilience measures in local planning policy. And finally, improve local knowledge and awareness. Further information on how we achieve these targets is available within the strategy document. So in order to mitigate the risk of flooding through Doncaster, we are now promoting a number of flood risk management schemes, including projects at Bentley. The proposals include utilising catchment stories, relocating overtopping points for the River Don, and renaturalising watercourses. At Fish Lake, our flood risk management strategy proposal includes local interventions to support the community before, during and after a flood, including installing a pumping pad to return flood water to the river and clough door replacements. Within Conisborough, at Dufton's Close, we have flood resilient measures to a group of 13 properties and a natural flood risk management project throughout Kearsley Brook catchment and upstream of Conisborough to reduce the peak flows and increase response time to the village during events. We have the Dig Suds project, which is to install retrospective suds within the highway and public open space at Clay Lane and Scorthorpe. At Stainforth, we're undertaking a surface water modelling study in order to determine the flood risk area, the flood risk for Stainforth, and update the risk of flooding from surface water and national mapping. Intake, we're carrying out a similar nature-based sud scheme to help reduce surface water flooding during periods of heavy rainfall. And at Borderay, we've got a study to reduce surface water flooding by utilising the existing soakways, but also creating a connection to a positive system via a pumping station.
Thank you, Adam. Is that the presentation?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to just quickly press your red button off? Thank you. Okay. I know we have some questions. I think Councillor Debbie Hutchinson, you have the first question.
Thank you, Adam. So what are the current challenges in maintaining highway drainage systems, and what steps have been taken to mitigate flooding on roads?
Thank you, Councillor. So the main challenges in maintaining the highway drainage system are the pressures to our revenue budgets and increases in intense rainfall due to climate change. So traditionally, we operate a cyclical gully cleansing programme where gullies are cleansed on a ward-by-ward basis before the cycle repeats, and this usually takes around 2 years. Over the last few cycles, we've been implemented mobile technology to record the silt levels within the gullies, and we're looking to use this information to be more efficient and exploring producing a risk-based programme where some gullies that block more frequently are cleansed more regularly, and those that don't are cleansed less frequently. So in terms of funding, flood risk management funding is mainly focused on capital projects. We'll be shortly bidding for internal capital funds to increase the amount of repair and replacements we can do on defective highway drains to reduce the amount of standing water on the roads. And to combat the effects of climate change, we incorporate allowances within our designs so that new drainage systems that we either construct ourselves or adopt are effective for the lifeline of the development and their standard life. No problem.
Councillor James Church, did you want to ask another question? Okay. I think you've gone, Councillor David Nevitt.
Thank you. You noted there about water levels on roads when near gullies. Can you just explain a bit more about gullies and cleansing? Because I did report one some months ago, and it was reported back that it wasn't a danger to the road, even though there was standing water whenever it rains.
Yes, of course, Councillor. So we each gully, when we receive a report of a blocked gully, that's assessed by one of our engineers and prioritised based on a risk-based approach. So, for example, if there's a blocked gully on a hill and the next gully is clear and water can clearly run to that gully, then those are not prioritised. And the reason we do that is to be efficient with our cleansing service. As I suggested earlier, the tankers are in a ward at a time. So if they stay within those wards, they can cleanse more gullies per day and get around the whole cycle quicker. Whereas if we're sending them to individual gullies across the borough, it decreases the efficiency and takes longer to cleanse more gullies. So they are inspected, and if they do pose a risk to property or road users, then we are ensure they are cleared. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I did contact you because a resident contacted me about this. It's next to a bus stop, and the water does get quite deep there and across the road as well. And it goes up to a bridge, so you've got all the runoff from the bridge to this particular gully. I mean, I can give praise for you cleaning the gullies, because when I've asked for gullies to be cleaned, it has happened in the past. And you did spray them with a yellow dot when they'd been cleansed, so people were asking the question why there was a yellow dot on them. So it's good that that has been noted and people can see that there's something happened. But with that particular gully, opposite the Glass House pub, it does get quite deep, and there's quite a lot of spray into the footpath area. So, I mean, if in future you can make some attempts at looking at that, it'd be appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, no problem, Councillor. We'll look into that specific instance, and I'll feed back to you. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor James Church, I know you've got a question.
Can you clarify what process takes place after a road has been closed due to flooding? And the reason why I'm asking this is because sometimes I feel our residents don't understand actually the process. They think once the water's gone, then the road they should be able to use that road. But obviously, for instance, Forstead Lane, which is an issue throughout the year, yeah, it's regular. People, we get it in the ear because residents just do not understand that once the water's gone, they can't go on it.
Yes, of course, Councillor. I understand those frustrations, but we need to carry out specific checks on the road before we can reopen it, because it often contains hidden dangers There may have been manholes surcharged and that are now loose that we need to rectify. So the specific process for reopening a road following flooding is firstly one of our flood risk engineers will visit the site and ensure the water's subsided and it's not likely to return. This visit will include an inspection of the current highway drainage system on the road to make sure that's working effectively and there's no hidden dangers on there. May also require a tanker to cleanse any of the gullies or highway drainage system on site. The road's then swept to remove any debris and to allow a visual inspection of the road surface, so our highway inspectors can repair any defects to the road surface. So when these checks have been complete and signed off, it's then the traffic management's removed and we communicate that message with the public. So it's probably worth mentioning that we do work during evenings and even weekends when we have a lot of road closures due to flooding to make sure they're checked regularly, because we understand the delays it causes on the road network when they are closed. So we don't close them lightly, but thank you.
I appreciate the work because obviously we've had the communications, but I just don't think sometimes that the public are aware of the level of what you have to do to get the road back up to standard and make it safe again. So that's something that perhaps we need to work on so that people are aware. For instance, Forstead Lane last year, I think you ended up relaying 60 yards or 60 metres of tarmac, and people were just so frustrated, but they didn't understand some of the hard work that had gone in to get that road back together and safe for everyone.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, that's correct. We did have to do a lot of resurfacing works on Forstead Lane, and we can look how we can communicate with those messages to the public about the works we are carrying out before the roads reopened during an event. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any further questions from the panel? No. Okay. Ian, do you have any questions towards the panel as part of Housing and Regen?
Yes, please, Chair. My interest is partly on Section 38 adoptions of housing estates and whether or not the actual gullies installed and the pipework actually meets the adoption criteria for the Highways Act. And the other part is very much about the use of negative and positive camber and the correct size gully depths. In sort of the 1950s, gullies were put in that were quite not very deep at all and didn't hold a lot before they started to run through the system. Are we swapping to a larger, deeper gully to deal with the issue of the environment changing, and are we making, you say, there's been mention about the various colours. My worry is that sometimes we use the same paint twice for a visit, so when people can't work out when the visit was in the last 2 years, and the gullies and the way they're laid and sunk causes pooling around it. So if you could comment on that, I'd be most grateful.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Councillor. We carry out a technical appraisal when we adopt any road to on new developments. The standards that we work to are the design manual for roads and bridges for highway gullies, and also the specific standards for the sewers and the gullies in those. If you've got any questions, I can send details through to yourself about the specific specifications we work to on gully depths. Regarding the paint, we use one colour paint per cycle. There may be a couple of visits to one gully during the same cycle. So if we do a visit during the cyclical cleanse and then we do a reactive visit due to a report of a blocked gully, then they'd use the same colour paint, but then they're swapped when they move on to the next cycle.
Are you happy with the response, Councillor Ian Pearson?
Thank you very much. I did ask further about the whole concept of the gullies I think I've got the specifications from the Act because it's what I used to do. I'm more interested in the future. Some of the legislation from the 51 or the 80s Act is not best practice in the fact of the reality of environmental change. So I'm more interested in, we get lots of new planning applications, and in Zone 3 in particular, we shouldn't be sitting on what the department recommends. We should be working on better beacon standard of excellence for flood drainage and the like. So I'm more interested in not what the book says, I'm more interested in where we're developing future proofing, because the local authority, after the Section 38 adoption has taken place, obviously has full cost bearance on it, and I worry that we're accepting it at the basic level and then we get the bill to improve, upgrade and actually put right things where there are blockages because nobody bothered putting a camera down. So I'm concerned that we're living on our laurels rather than future-proofing. Thank you, Chair.
Do you want to come back on that, Adam?
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. We do have allowances built into our design standards to allow for the changes to the climate. They are prepared nationally and they are continually updated. So we include, for example, up to 40% for an increase in rainfall intensities in our surface water designs.
If I could, Chair, I think Councillor Pearson's raised a really good point. I think the reality is we have a significant amount of infrastructure, highways and in relation to flood resilience, which is ageing, which was done at a time when things were different. The climate was different, the challenge that we faced environmentally was different, and the number of houses and land gone to absorb water was different. So I do think going forward, if there is a look at some of the planning reforms, which is talked about in relation to least recent government announcements and having more houses, I think there needs to be consideration given to reflecting that in the environmental considerations as well, particularly around drainage, particularly around infrastructure. What I would say, I think we can evidence that we're committed to what we can do going forward within the legislation and within the relevant pieces of planning policy. But the problem we have, and I want to be honest here, is Doncaster covers what, 47% of South Yorkshire? It's a big area. We do have a latent challenge with old infrastructure, and that is a problem and a difficulty for us. And I think we do as well as we can within the circumstances, but I concede going forward, is there a need to think nationally about the policy position in relation to the infrastructure that goes along with housing and goes along with development to assist with environmental impacts?
Okay, thank you. I'm assuming there's no further questions to that comment. Okay, thank you for that presentation. Just to make note, we will have additional questions at the end, which might, following all the presentations, that might be like multi-agency kind of response, so just to make you aware, so we might have you responding later on. So our next presentation is from the Environmental Agency. Okay, thank you.
So thanks Doncaster Council and thanks councillors for inviting us to speak today. As I introduced myself earlier, I'm Ben Brass. I'm a Senior Flood Risk Advisor at the Environment Agency. I've been with them for since 2017. I've been working very closely with lead local flood authorities across South Yorkshire, but predominantly Doncaster Council, Yorkshire Water and IDBs within the Doncaster Council area. My job role is primarily focused on engaging with flood-affected communities, but also supporting risk management authorities develop schemes to help reduce the risk of flooding. I'll be honest, I haven't tried this slide deck on this controller, so I don't know how well it will work, but I'll have a go. So what I was hoping to talk to you today about is obviously what the Environment Agency do, some of the works we have completed since 2019 to reduce flood risk across Doncaster. I was asked to give us a bit of an overview on how flood risk management projects are funded. I also wanted to let you know some of the projects we're working on, which will be delivered over the next few years, which will continue to reduce flood risk across Doncaster. I have got a final slide on knowing how to stay safe during a flood event, but I did note there was a question around flood warnings, which may answer that more in better. So I'll come to that and then see where we are. So I don't know how many people in the room have kind of come across the Environment Agency and what we do. Obviously, predominantly I'm here to talk about flooding, but effectively we're centred around creating a better place for people, wildlife, and also supporting sustainable development. So in England, we're responsible for regulating industry and waste, the treatment of contaminated land, water quality and water resources, and also fisheries, conservation and ecology. But as I said, today I'm primarily here to talk about how we can increase the resilience of people, property and businesses to the increasing risk of flooding. So here's just a short slide which shows some of the work that we've carried out over the past few years. Some of these pictures will be from Doncaster, but I don't know how to make the video play, if anyone knows how to make it play. Oh, okay. Well, give us some time back then. Oh no, there it is. Yeah. So this is some of our field operations team out clearing debris from trash screens, which happens across the borough, for example, in Conisborough. This is where we're supporting IDBs in additional pumping if there is overtopping. And I think that just before that was to do with the flood warnings. So it's a very quick overview of some of the things that we do in general. As I said, I'll tell you about some of the works that we've completed since 2019. So one of the biggest projects that we've completed is Bentley Ings Pumping Station. Now Bentley Ings Pumping Station actually pumps water 24/7. It's situated in Bentley Ings, and it manages water levels on Mill Dyke, Swathe Dyke and also Bentley Ings Drain. It works 24/7 to reduce flood risk and stop the community of Bentley flooding on a day-to-day basis, which not many people know about or understand. I think what the confusion arises is that it isn't designed to pump water from the River Don back into the Don. The water would pass through those big arches and then go into the Bentley flood corridor and storage area, and then it discharges into the Don when the Don is low. But obviously, since the refurbishment, I think in 2007 it failed, which probably led to flooding of properties around there. 2019 it was fully operational, and obviously through all the storm events we've had since, it's been fully operational as well. Since again 2019, and these figures are correct, as of November 2023, we've spent over £16.5 million on recovery works across the borough. So that has been predominantly to repair works that we've had from all the increased storms that we're seeing. It's work such as topping up low spots on embankments, repairing erosion, and also, as you can see, such as the Sarria Bentley works. Obviously that was a massive piece of bank stabilisation, but they've been quite spread out across, as what Dan said, is a very large area. And what they're aimed at doing is bringing our existing defences back up to the standard that they were designed to be. which means that they can operate as designed. What I'll do in a couple of slides, we are obviously, while these are going on, we're working on more strategic schemes which are designed to reduce flood risk, but I'll come to those separately. Before I jump into funding, I just wanted to pull up this slide really. We call it the investment journey, and that demonstrates all the different steps that you have to go through to find an opportunity right through to starting it. So that's let's do it. So that's before even you get into the programme of construction. Obviously, there's so many steps because what we need to do is implement solutions that are both acceptable environmentally, socially, and are also technically feasible and affordable. Unfortunately, this does take a long process, and on average, schemes can take about 8 years to pass through these different steps. So yeah, funding. The primary source of funding for flood risk management projects is called Flood Defence Grant in Aid, and that's a central government funding pot. It comes through DEFRA, who are the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and any flood risk management authority, so the Environment Agency, Doncaster Council, Drainage Board, can all bid in or apply for a grant. And that grant could be for a study to better understand what the flood risk is in that area, or it could be to develop works, capital maintenance, those types of things. The way that Flood Defence Grant in Aid is allocated, the criteria for gaining it focuses on basically an assessment of the costs of the scheme and weighs that up against what we call damages avoided, so the cost of the damage that you're going to avoid from implementing the scheme, because obviously it's public funding, so there has to be some checks around that. What it does do is it puts emphasis on providing support to the areas that are at most at risk across the country, and the areas that are the most deprived across the country also. Where it doesn't support certain locations is those locations that already benefit from existing flood defences. So it is very difficult to attract government funding if a community is already benefiting from existing defences. Obviously, those existing defences have been built over many, many years now. DEFRA do recognise this, and so they also offer what we call asset replacement allowance, and we can use that to close the funding gap when we're trying to repair assets to make sure they're maintained for the future. Obviously, government funding, they're limited, and they cannot fund all the schemes that are out there, and they also cannot provide schemes that manage all flooding. And so often there's a shortfall on schemes, and that's when we have to look for what we call partnership funding. So partnership funding can be secured from any other beneficiaries of the scheme. So that could be businesses that benefit, it could be housing developers that benefit, it could be infrastructure providers such as Network Rail. But obviously the difficulty is getting that money from these other parties, and that's where which again can take lots of time and add to that process of developing projects. So now I'll just pull up a couple of slides on projects that we're currently delivering to reduce flood risk in Doncaster. Many people will know this area. They might not know it as St Mary's Bridge, but it is close to the Doncaster depot, the VW garage kind of area. It's an existing asset. It's coming to the end of its life. It better protects over 500 properties. And what we need to do is obviously repair it to ensure it continues to provide that for the next 100 years. You'll see there, to do that, it's going to cost about £2.4 million. And obviously we need to share the benefits behind that with other projects such as Doncaster's Bentley scheme. So we get into a position where we're obviously having to speak to each other and work in partnership to make sure that we're delivering these schemes that are going to best benefit the communities. That should be starting summer next year and be complete by winter 25. Wheatley Park Embankment, this is probably one of the biggest schemes in South Yorkshire currently. It's a £30 million scheme, and this it's an embankment that's situated, you're looking towards Doncaster there, and the embankment is situated between the River Don and the Don Navigation Canal. I mean, we've taken a conservative estimate there of better protecting 2,000 properties, but if it goes into the canal, it could better protect, it could lead to increased flood risk to over 8,000 properties. We've got, because it's £30 million, obviously that's very difficult to fund from just better protecting properties. We've got to look for businesses. We're going to be speaking to partners such as Network Rail, Canal River Trust, City of Doncaster Council to close what is currently a £15.7 million funding gap. But we still believe that we'll be starting construction for that in May 26. Then there's some more what I call smaller projects, but again, making sure that the assets that we have are fit for purpose and work into the future. So this is Went Outfall. It's actually in Goole, but obviously it's a very complicated area. And what Went Outfall does, it stops the Don flowing into the Went when the Don is up high or if tides are coming up the Don. And obviously if that were to happen, you'd have the North Sea flowing in up the Went through Sykehouse into that potential flooded area, which includes foster houses, Fish Lake, Topham. Again, limited number of properties, but big costs to do these big civil engineering projects. So that's estimated to cost about 1.5 million, and based on the number of properties there, the government will only give us 250,000 to develop that. So we're obviously having to find the money from other sources. Again, another small embankment work, piece of work which Vicky's been out to see. Again, it's not too bad, this one, but what we want to do is make sure that it's easier for our field teams and field operatives to maintain so that we can spot any potential defects before they become something more serious. So it's keeping on top of that maintenance and making sure that all the assets are in a good and fit state. And then this is a bit of a strange one.
Sorry, Ben, will you be able to state which area you were referring to for the presentation before, just so Councillor Pearson is aware?
Sorry, Councillor Pearson. So that was Whitecross Embankment. So that's on EBEC, and that is better protecting Carcroft, Addickless Street area. Went Outfall, as I said, it's on the Don, but it's on the mouth of the River Went, so it better protects Fish Lake, Pinchin Green, Sykehouse, foster houses.
For clarity, can you explain to me what the siphon US head wall is? It does say something in, drainage in the area is inhibited, investigation repairs required to siphon. What does that mean? So
the siphon, the way that these system of embankments work, obviously the embankment would act as it stops the water from getting to the land drainage and to Goose Pool pumping station, which is on the other side of EBEC. So obviously there's what we call a siphon, so it's a pipe under the embankment which allows the water to, instead of it just pooling along the side of the embankment, the water can then drain under the embankment. So obviously we need to make sure that if we're going to be doing work there, to make sure that the embankment is robust, we want to ensure that that siphon is working correctly as well. So Don regulators. Now this is an interesting one, and it's because it's not actually situated within Doncaster. It's situated within Rotherham, and what the regulators do, there's 3 large gates which are situated on the River Rother, and what we do is use those to avoid a double peak coming through the Don. So what we do is we hold back the River Don and allow, we hold back the River Rother and allow the Don peak to pass through. Because if they weren't there and the River Rother came through at the same time as the River Don came through, there'd be additional water which would overtop the existing defences throughout Doncaster, and that's for all areas in Doncaster. So that could be Conisbrough, it could be Dennerby, it could be Bentley, but obviously it's very difficult to justify a scheme based on current funding rules when these were built back in the 50s or 60s, when there was much less scrutiny and people could pretty much do what they wanted. Now, obviously, we've got these assets. They're coming to the end of their lives, and so we're having to find almost £15 million to refurbish those so that they're good into the future. But obviously, it's a balance, isn't it? Because Rotherham, they're located in Rotherham, but Rotherham Council won't want to pay for assets that don't better protect Rotherham. They better protect Doncaster, and obviously we want to make sure that they keep functioning as they've been designed to do. And then another slide, so we also have what we call source to sea lower Don, which we're working with multiple partners to take a catchment approach, so not just looking at the sort of source pathway receptor, i.e. properties which are behind existing embankments. So this is looking at opportunities throughout the catchment to slow the flow and slow the amount of water that's getting into rivers. But more specifically for the Doncaster area, what we're carrying out is a review of assets to better understand what condition they're in, how much it will cost to refurbish them, and also what benefits or what damage is avoided having them there, so that we can justify that to government. But while we're doing that, we're also working with partners such as wildlife trusts and other sectors to look for ways that we can carry out nature-based solutions and engineering with nature, again, to slow the flow of water getting into the Don. So this is my last slide, and as I said, I did notice there was a question came through around flood warnings. So I thought, just while I've got this slide up, I just thought I'd kind of ensure that we're all working to the same understanding of what flood alerts are and what flood warnings are. So basically, the Environment Agency offers a free service, and what communities, residents, anyone here can sign up to are flood alerts and flood warnings. And what flood alerts do is they alert people that flooding is possible. They generally come out between 2 days to 2 hours before potential onset of flooding, but that is obviously dependent on forecasts, which obviously, as we all know, can change. And what we hope to do is that let communities know that flooding could happen and that they should be ready to take action if necessary. This can then be escalated to a flood warning, and we issue these if properties are expected to flood or where we think flooding might be likely. And this is a signal that people should take action. Now, flood warnings do save lives, but they also enable emergency services to prepare and help communities. And that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Just because you picked up on that one, I'm going to take Rob. Did you want to ask additional question, particularly?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, Ben. So just lastly on the flood warning system, thank you for talking to us about it. Has there been any improvements specifically since 2019 in the Doncaster area to improve the flood warning system?
Thank you. I can answer that one. So, as Ben alluded to there, the efficacy of a flood warning system is very much dependent on communities and individuals' understanding of that. So we've done a lot of work with partners as well within the Doncaster area to make sure that people do understand what our flood warning service means. We also validate our warnings after every time it's issued. What we don't want to do is we don't want to issue a warning late. We don't want to issue a warning and actually flooding doesn't happen, so people don't believe that. So we will look at how we trigger those warnings, how we go through that process, and how it lands. So therefore, again, are people getting those warnings? Are they understanding those warnings? And I would urge everyone in the room to really kind of work with us to make sure that communities do understand when you get a flood alert, you need to get ready. And when you get a flood warning, as far as the Environment Agency are concerned, we believe that you will flood. We can't offer a flood warning service to individual properties. So we do that in flood warning areas, and they will go when we forecast that that first property to flood will flood. We don't always get that right. It's very much dependent on the forecasts that we receive and the models that they then feed into. So after every incident, and this happened in Doncaster, we will look at those forecasts, we will look at how effective they have been, and we will feed into a programme of works where we believe that we can make improvements on those forecasts. That helps us as duty officers, when we're in the incident room, make better decisions when we're issuing our warnings and when we're providing people and partners with more information. So that is an ongoing process that always happens. There are 38 flood warnings across Doncaster. So again, there are dedicated people that will be looking at how effective they have been, and improvements to the flood warning areas will be made and improvements to those triggers. We work really closely with the Met Office, as you might imagine. So again, we will be, working in partnership to ensure that their information for South Yorkshire, for Yorkshire, for the whole country is as good as it can be. And we also have a flood forecasting centre based down in Exeter, where we have Environment Agency people and Met Office people working together to make sure that that service is as good as it can be. We also publish forecasts on the internet, and again, we review those to make sure that they are given the best information possible. With a forecast, that there is, the closer to the river rising it gets, the better that forecast will be. So something I always say to people is, if we're basing a forecast on the water not actually falling out of the sky yet, then it's not going to be a very good forecast. So we're working on making sure that we can almost put bounds around our forecast to say how confident we are on those. We want people to be able to help themselves, but we don't want to give them too much information that they sort of make the wrong choices. And then we also do a lot of training in the incident room. We learn from every incident to make sure that next time that happens, we are better prepared. And we'll do that with partners as well. So we've just been talking about how we can exercise and how we can all better understand the actions that we need to take. We've carried out several drop-ins. We've got a couple already planned as well for later in the year, where people can come and talk to us and understand what actions they need to take based on the information that we give them. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I had a question, but I think partially it's answered, particularly because I asked questions about specific measures that have been taken since 2019, which you've covered detail. The second part is, how are the existing defences monitored for effectiveness? Because you mentioned about the lifespan, so how do you measure it? Obviously you've got the lifespan, but obviously if it's being used, it obviously gets weighs down as well.
I'm stealing your thunder here, Ben, apologies. I am responsible for the teams that maintain the existing assets that we have, and also the teams that plan that maintenance. So prior to a forecast of heavy rainfall, my teams will be out clearing out outfalls. They will be looking at our defences, making sure that they can act when they are needed. We do, as we've already spoke about, we do have a legacy of old assets now that do have, we do need to make sure that they are resilient. And that's not just now, but in the future as well with climate change. Annually, we inspect our assets. We have asset inspectors who are trained, and specifically carry out those activities so that they can see and identify if we need to do works. And that could be erosion damage, it could be vermin damage, it could be that the grass has got too long, we can't inspect it, therefore we send a team out to cut that grass. So there's continuous activities happening around inspecting our assets. After every flood incident, we also do a post-incident inspection, and that will feed into what Ben spoke about with recovery works. So, for example, in 2019, 2020 and last year, we had water up against our assets for a long time. And that's when they will start to show us what we need to do. So since then, we have had some slips in some of our embankments on the Lower Don, and there is an emergency pot available to us when there's that real risk of failure. But that has to be evidenced. We can't just ask for emergency money on a whim, because that's a good way of getting the money. It has to be evidenced. And then preparing for this winter, we're doing walkovers, ensuring that there aren't any large debris or trees in the river so that we can clear those in preparation. We are sandbagging certain areas where we are planning to do some works. We're just not there yet. So we would call that winter preparedness and make sure that our assets are as good as they can be. But it is a problem when you've sort of got a legacy of 1950s embankments that we're not entirely sure why they were built to that height or to that level, or even how they were built. So there is that ongoing legacy where we need to secure the funding to ensure that what we do have that protects communities continues to work into the future.
Thank you. Okay. Yes, do you want to ask a question?
I think now's the point that we need to raise something that's obviously not going to be discussed unless it's raised. The National Audit Office, and we don't work with you guys, because the EA works in Doncaster, and there's two parts. There's EA Trent, which covers the bottom third, if you like, physically of the borough. And then there's EA Yorkshire, you guys. We don't work with you. The drainage boards that work with you aren't here. But the National Audit Office has highlighted some stuff last year that clearly you're aware of, and this isn't these guys' fault. And I'm really pleased, I didn't know what your presentation was going to be. And we've heard everyone from Dan talk about ageing infrastructure on roads, gullies, right the way up to you've got equipment and assets sitting out there, you don't know why they were built that way, they're getting old, they're getting past the sell-by date. We're the same on drainage boards. We've got coal authority pumps that are no longer in use because the pits have gone, so they sit there. Some of the pumps that we maintain, they pay us to maintain because they still belong to the coal authority. You've got a £5 billion flood programme nationally, 5 billion, and we're halfway through. And what's happened is the target for protecting 336 houses has been reduced to 200,000. And 2,000 separate projects have been shelved because they can't get them done. There's all kinds of reasons for that. There's lack of staff, there's lack of engineers. You've just heard about St Mary's Wall, which in 2019 caused real concern. Work doesn't start until next year. 6 years to get that project through a system. And in the meantime, the National Audit Office has pointed out that continually spending money on new assets and not replacing the older ones is putting a further 200,000 properties at risk. It's a pretty devastating report. So, but the Treasury will not let them spend money on maintenance because that's revenue. It's not capital. So I can be cynical and say, what we want to do here is we want to build nice shiny things that we can point the residents at and go, look what we're doing about flooding. But everything below that is creaking, and that's where we are at the moment. So this committee may want to come up with what its view is, or you may want a follow-up meeting to this, just to look at the funding and decide what your view is on that. Because there's a huge imbalance recognised nationally between spending on capital and spending on updoing existing maintenance and infrastructure. The River Went is a classic. There's £15.7 million gap in a project everyone recognises. and we've got £5 billion project, and probably 2 billion of that could go unspent in the next 3 years. And you're agreeing. It's nonsense. The Treasury has admitted it is possible to move money from revenue to capital, but they're not doing it. There's no sign of them doing it. And personally, I've been in meetings for 15 years or more and raised this point over and over again, that we've got all this kit and caboodle everywhere that's well past its sell-by date, needs upgrading or even fully replacing, but they class that as revenue, not capital, and you can't do it. And there's gaps in the funding. The funding the drainage board gets comes from the council. It's in the council. It's within. It's an element of the council tax. So if we decide to spend money like water, we've got to come to you for the money, but the end result being obvious. So it's something, maybe it's a discussion further for this meeting, or it's for another meeting to talk about how we actually fund this stuff and which is the priority here. So we've just seen a load of projects listed that everyone wants to go ahead with and can't because there's gaps in the funding, and we've got billions of pounds sitting there that nobody can spend.
Thank you, Chris.
So that's my rant for today.
I was going to add before you jumped in, I was going to say it would be something
But those
for us
figures
to add
I've
to a
just read out to you,
recommendation at the end.
it's shocking.
Yes, we'll look at it as a recommendation at the end, but I am conscious of time as well. I've got
Right,
questions.
okay.
Thank you, Mr. I know we're coming back to yourselves shortly. Councillor Emma Rowlands, would you like to ask a question?
You have answered the first part of the question with DEFRA and things, but the question in itself is the primary sources of funding for flood risk management projects, and what are the anticipated shortfalls, and are there any additional needs?
Yes, I mean, as I said, the primary source is flood defence grant and aid. I think that's what Chris was referring to. Unfortunately, the Environment Agency, the IDB, Doncaster Council, Rotherham Council, we all work within the same funding framework where the money is effectively pushed towards new shiny schemes that reduce flood risk to communities that don't have existing flood schemes. So obviously we're talking about old aging systems, but there are flood defences already in existence, so nationally preferred option would be to maintain those systems. Now, although I do agree with you on some points, obviously the schemes that we're doing there are existing assets which we are developing schemes for to make sure that we can be confident in how they perform over coming years. And I did notice that someone from York and Humber Drainage Board was meant to be here, but obviously I can't speak for colleagues in other areas, but I've certainly secured funding for York and Humber Drainage Board to do all kinds of things, including studies, telemetry, pumping station refurbishments, but it is based on them better protecting, it's primarily homes. There's some money for businesses, there's obviously some money for agricultural land, but the funding from DEFRA, the Flood Defence Grant and Aid, is primarily driven towards better protecting homes. And the more homes you better protect, the more funding you're going to get, which does put us in a situation where there are funding gaps. And that's why I alluded to the Environment Agency. DEFRA have seen that we have so many assets, and therefore this asset replacement allowance, which can be used to close that funding gap, but only to maintain the asset to the existing level that it is today, but also that we have to have sought contributions from other pots. Now, obviously, in the past, there might have been a contribution coming forward from Doncaster Council, but Doncaster Council, their funds are very stretched, and we're obviously working with Doncaster Council to deliver their own flood risk management schemes. So then it's a case of going, well, who's the beneficiary? So we'll go to potentially Network Rail. Network Rail may be interested if it's going to cause them a loss, but again, trying to work with an organisation like Network Rail to find out the right person to even get that on their agenda and get them is such a long, drawn-out process. So there are, and we are aware of funding gaps, but this is why we need to carry on with for example, the asset review, because that will give us a clearer picture of not only what works need to happen where, but also the cost of doing those works. That will then give us what the gaps are, and then obviously we can work through our channels to try and secure that. but we don't have all the answers, and we don't have a blank checkbook, unfortunately.
Councillor James Church, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. I think you've spoken quite a bit about the question that I'm going to ask, so I'm going to adjust it a little bit, because the frustration that was expressed to me by a local farmer in his area, he was frustrated about the response and maintenance of pumping stations. Now, you've kind of spoke about that. Are the pumping stations, are they inspected every year, or are they inspected more regularly? Because he was a little bit frustrated about, he'd informed the Environment Agency that there were issues with them pumping stations, and sometimes you responded adequately and he felt sometimes you didn't. Now, in terms of the shiny new products, I've been to the pumping station about, I think we were there when it was officially opened, and I've seen that shiny new facility, and it does make a real difference. So it's interesting to hear the difference between maintaining what needs maintaining and the desire to have new facilities to protect our areas. But the frustration's there. But do you feel that our local farmers can have complete trust in you being able to maintain them pumping stations?
So thanks, Councillor Church. Obviously, there's a few different questions there. The pumping station that we visited in Bentley was an IDB asset, a coal authority asset, but it was handed over to the Environment Agency because it has flood risk benefits, i.e. it protects many homes throughout that area. That therefore meant that we could generate flood defence grant and aid. There was still a shortfall, but we managed to close that with contributions from the Coal Authority, Yorkshire Water and other partners. If you've got a pumping station in the middle of nowhere, and as Chris said, some of them are probably defunct, they're ex-Coal Authority assets, there's no mining there, they aren't doing what they were designed to do, and they... But the Environment Agency aren't necessarily managing those assets, so the Internal Drainage Board may be managing them on behalf of the Coal Authority. The Coal Authority are still, in my mind, providing some finances to the IDB for them to manage that asset and do what they need to do to that asset. Again, the IDB can apply for a grant from DEFRA to do work to that asset, but the problem is, as I've been quite open about, is unless that you can show that that asset is reducing flood risk to a number of properties, you're just not going to get the flood defence grants in aid to be able to make a successful project stack up. And going back to the economic benefits, you have to show that spending money on that asset, the amount of money you spend needs to equal, as a minimum, the potential damage of that asset not being working correctly. So unfortunately, you do some calculations based on, well, how much would you lose financially, or how much would the government, or how much would UK PLC lose financially if that wasn't going to be working? And if you've got houses who are going to have to, you're going to have to replace furniture, you're going to have to replace TVs, you're going to have to be putting temporary accommodation, it's going to be expensive, and therefore, obviously, you can make a project stack up. If the project is to protect, unfortunately, and there are areas in Doncaster where it might be one home and some agricultural buildings. Unfortunately, the system that we work within isn't necessarily geared up to throw large amounts of money at those particular schemes. So that's why it makes it particularly difficult. What we do try and do is obviously work with IDBs. So I think Adam's mentioned that we've got joint pumping operations we're looking to do, and we already have them, and we've talked about these exceedance. So it's exceedance planning. So if it is the river overtopping into these areas, and then because of subsidence, the pumping stations are there to drain a small amount of water, land drainage. What we try and do, if we have assets available, obviously we're an organisation that's across the country and we have to prioritise reducing risk to homes. If we have assets available, we will send large pumps to work with Doncaster Council and the IDB to set up temporary pumping to get the water back off fields and back into into rivers, but obviously our primary driver is homes and properties, unfortunately. So there's that, and then there's also, and it's obviously filtered down. I don't know how much your organisation's getting, but for example, the government's recently announced £75 million towards IDBs to allow them to, I guess, pay for unforeseen bills and work on assets. And I know that Danum IDB certainly have put in some bids for that, and I believe been successful. So we're doing what we can with the money that's available.
Okay, Councillor Debbie Hutchinson, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. Could an explanation be provided about how the river and canal levels are monitored and managed, particularly when the floodgates in the Goole area are opened? And how does them being closed impact on the backflow of water into the Don?
So we've talked about warnings, and that comes from telemetry. So the Environment Agency has a team called the National Telemetry Service, and telemetry is the automated collection and transmission of information. So, for example, remote points, it will provide information to a central hub, and it underpins pretty much everything we do. It underpins our warning and forecasting, it underpins our resource management and regulation, and also our incident management. What we don't measure, however, is canals, because canals are looked after by Canals and River Trust. So canal have their own monitoring, but that's predominantly for canal users, and it will look at levels, and it will look at areas of high flow, but they are not classed by us as your traditional flood risk assets. So obviously all the rivers that we monitor, you can go to gov.uk, you can look to see what the levels are historically and potentially forecast as well to get an indication of what that are. So we don't monitor canals. But leading to the second part of the question, it was a bit of a curveball because the floodgates, there aren't any floodgates in Goole that are connected to the Don. The Don drains naturally into the Humber estuary. There are dock gates in Goole, but the connection from there out to sea comes from the River Aire. And the dock gates are primarily there to maintain water levels to allow ships in and out during different tides. In terms of and how you will be able to know that there's no gates on the Don is tidally influenced pretty much all the way. I mean, it comes all the way up. The tidal seawater comes all the way up to Doncaster city centre. The tidal signal, however, and you can see on the Don river level all the way up to about Kirk Bramworth, Stainforth area, you can see that when the tides come in, it causes the river levels to rise, and then obviously when the tides go out, the river levels low, and you can see that tidal signal. But why that's particularly important, why I'm going into so much detail about it, is because obviously the tidal influence can impact on the Don's ability to drain out. So if you've got a lot of water in the Don, and then you have a tidal system that's stopping the water draining out. So for example, if it's a neat tide and you have higher low tides and lower high tides, it doesn't give that time for water to drain out, and that's actually what happened in 2019. And it affects, so basically you end up with an accumulation of water that just can't get out to sea. So obviously I haven't got any colleagues from here today, and I know Dan and Adam attend some of the meetings, but the Environment Agency's progressing Humber 2100 strategy, and that's looking to see how, going into the future, obviously 2100, how we can reduce the risk to inland communities when we're going to be experiencing what we believe to be higher influx of tides and sea level rise.
Okay, I've got two questions. I was going to say after these questions we'll probably have to move on. So, Councillor, I've got three questions, okay, and then we'll move on. Okay. so conscious of time. So, Councillor Rob Dennis, you had your hand up. Do you want to go first?
Thank you, Chair. Ben, earlier on in your presentation, you mentioned that it could take 8 years for any new, anything to come from an idea to actual inception. I used to be a civil servant, so I know how long things can take. But if an area is flooded, residents would be unhappy to know that it could take so long for anything to go through the bureaucratic process. Granted, it's a case-by-case process. Does it really take 8 years to go through all that process? And is there any way for it to be expedited? And you mentioned earlier on that if there's more likely funding for places that don't currently have any sort of flood management system in place. So does that also affect how long the process can take?
It's a good question, Councillor Dennis, but it's yes, there is, as you say, there's a lot of paperwork to go through, but what you first have to do is identify what the problem is. So is it fluvial? Is it surface water? Is it groundwater? There's then, obviously, that's fine, we can find the problem. How are you going to stop that problem? If you build a wall in one location, are you going to then stop water coming from the other side? So you're going to create another problem. So what you need to go through is obviously a lot of options appraisal. So looking at all the different options, and obviously what we'd want to do during that process as well is speak to communities, engage them in the decision making, because what someone might want might not necessarily be what is technically feasible or affordable. So there's obviously a lot of these sort of early things that need to happen, but to do that you might need modelling, for example. Now it's very hard unless there's an existing model there. You're going to have people out doing a survey, gathering all that information, feeding all that information in. That then has to be created into a mathematical model, so you're going to need a consultant to do that. That consultant's then going to take time to do that. They'll give you what they think happens in that area. You'll then go out to the community and say, well, this is what the mathematical model shows happens in this community. And the community will say, well, no, it doesn't work like that. We've lived here for X amount of years, and they'll have probably a better understanding than someone who's never been out to see it. And that's just a small, tiny portion of the thing. And then you're going to have to start testing it. So although, yes, there is a lot of paperwork or bureaucracy, whatever you want to call it, there's certain steps that you need to go through to make sure that what you're going to do in that location is the best thing that you can do in that location. Then, obviously, once you get to that point and you've decided what the risk is, you've decided how you're potentially going to stop it, you then got to look at the options to do that. Now, some options are fairly straightforward, but there's obviously, it's a system. What you do in one place could have an impact on somewhere else. So if you do that, then you've got to think of the impacts and mitigate against those impacts. Then you're doing more and more options, and you've got to look at the different ground conditions. There's no point in building a wall if the water's just going to keep, so then you've got to get someone out to do that. So you've got to make sure it's buildable, technically feasible, and then, most importantly, affordable. You can't just go spending £10 million if you haven't got £10 million to spend, and there's not going to be £10 million. So you get to a point where you do all this work, you've got the option, and as we've said, you might not have the money to deliver it, so then you have to go out and speak to partners, and as I already said, the difficulty of trying to get funding from other people is really difficult. So it's all of these steps that obviously start adding up. Yes, if you've got something that's easy and inexpensive, then obviously you take a proportionate approach, and that project could take less time. So for example, the pumping station refurbishment that I was involved with, that asset was clearly at the end of its life. They weren't looking to build a brand new asset. They wanted to refurbish what they had there, give it another 15 years while we took a more strategic approach across the area. So that was quite easy or relatively easy to justify, because there was potential funders. There was the Coal Authority, there was Highways England, there was board members, there was Flood Defence Grant and Aid. So that was a much shorter period. So I think it can happen more quickly, but it's completely dependent on the project and the area that you're looking at.
Councillor David Never, is it short? Because I'm conscious
It
of
is,
time.
yeah. Would you agree that some drain doors have not been maintained and remain open as they are seized? And how will these be rectified?
That's yeah. I mean, I'd have to look at the specifics of that. But if we have to look at and prioritise through risk, and that's not just risk of flooding. That's risk of failure as well, or the risk of passing on that risk elsewhere. So we do have to take a pragmatic and prioritised approach to how we deliver. And when we deliver, and the money that we have to deliver. So there may be things that the impact of spending that is, it's very much like the cost benefit. You have to spend money to receive money, if you like, and so therefore, what's the benefit of really doing that? We don't own all of our outfalls. That there are IDB ones as well. So without going into the specifics, it's quite difficult to give you an answer there, other than we prioritise the work based on the risk of not doing it, essentially. I did want to just pick up on a couple of points around a lot of what Chris said was, we do agree with. A lot of what we've talked about today is policy. It's what the government and it's what DEFRA sets out, and Ben and I have to work within a framework. And we hope you get across that we are really passionate about the work that we do, and that we want to deliver as much as we can to the communities that flood. The projects that Ben went through there, a lot of those are maintenance of our existing assets, and they are extending the life of those existing assets. To my knowledge, we haven't had a huge failure that has resulted in flooding of properties in recent years. We have had slips, and we have been able to go in and rectify that issue. Regulators, end of their life, the risk of those failing was far greater than the risk of actual flooding. So, we had to do something about that. So we do the best that we can in the framework that we are given. But a lot of the things that we're talking about now is just something that is policy and needs to be addressed in that way.
And finally, is it a quick question, please, Councillor Thompson?
Yeah, hopefully. I've got loads, but I'll just ask this one. You mentioned sandbagging certain areas for winter readiness. Why in Fish Lake have the EAA been against sandbagging? During Storm Babette, I'm led to believe flood wardens had sandbag the bank to stop the overtopping into the village. Are we doing anything to raise the bank in this area?
Well, Ben could talk about what we're doing to raise the bank in that area, just to sort of confirm as to why we removed those. Again, we talked a lot today about maintenance of our assets and inspections of those, and those sandbags were unfortunately causing damage to that asset. And so longer term or medium term, there was a real risk of failure. And so the risk of flooding to Fish Lake was far greater in doing that. I completely understand why those sandbags were put down during that incident. But longer term, we do need to look at something that is more sustainable for them, and having third-party sandbags on our asset sort of just uncovers a huge amount of liability issues and maintenance issues. Fish Lake have assets that protect them from flooding. They also have assets that have exceeded. So we do recognise that we can't protect Fish Lake from every flood, but we do protect them from a lot of high levels, and they don't flood during those occurrences. So we need to make sure that that asset is still standing. In terms of longer term, Ben has been working with them.
Yeah, I mean, I can come in there. It comes back to what we've just been discussing. Fish Lake already have what we would class as a good standard of protection, and in the framework that we have is a good standard of protection. To increase that standard of protection, you would have to have the economic benefits behind that, and the policy that we work within would say, well, no, you're better off maintaining what they have at the moment, so that other areas who are flooding more regularly than Fish Lake, because obviously Fish Lake, although it was devastating, they have only flooded once in the past 50 years, 60 years. Now, we don't argue with the fact that that embankment overtopped, and so what we have, as I've alluded to, we now have contingencies in place for if that were to happen again. And what we can do is we can remove the water in a controlled fashion up to a certain point. So the water that is exceeding can be pumped away to a different location, and we've worked with Doncaster Council and Dagenham to organise how we can do that. Doncaster Council have also worked with the community and secured funding from South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority to replace some clough doors, which in theory would stop potential flood water draining up through the centre. We're working with the community to install permanent temporary infrastructure, so pumps, so that if there is overtopping, we can get the water out. But obviously, we can't just raise embankments there and not somewhere else, because if we raised embankments there, it's just going to push the problem downstream to another community, and then ultimately it would probably flood back through to Fish Lake anyway.
Thank you. I'll suggest if you've got any other questions, if you're able to email Ben after today, that'd be great. Okay, so thank you for the report. Moving on to the Internal Drainage Board. Right, I understand there's a bit of difficulty putting it onto the screen, and we've all got a copy. For any partners who haven't got a copy, there are a couple of spare packs at the front. I don't know if you want to talk through your...
Okay, yes, I shall do.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting us along this morning. You've seen the full brief. We're not going to go through that, and we are short of time, so I shall move on quite quickly. Just to cue you in on the actual board itself, though, it's just under 22,000 hectares, and it runs really covering an area south of the Don and to the east. And the board's boundaries delineated by the 8-foot contour line. Most of the land within that is at or below sea level, and it's artificially maintained. So if it wasn't for the work of the IDB and our partnership agencies, it would either be permanently flooded or seasonally waterlogged. So life that may appear normal isn't, and it has to be maintained to remain so. In terms of the board, it has 313 kilometres of watercourse and 24 pumping stations. And if you look at the area of the map, if you're able to see the area of the map, as I described it, there's lots of pumping stations with drains and watercourses coming from it. The actual system is not just the bricks and mortar bit at the end, but relies on the actual watercourses being able to convey the water to the pumping stations. And then we rely on the Environment Agency's main rivers to be able to evacuate that safely from those low-lying parts. And then we run into things of the frustrations that we've been talking about with regard to maintenance and the value of property versus the value of agricultural land. And we could disappear off into another realm of discussion on national food security and the ability of an island nation to be able to feed itself, and why is that not recognised more readily by central government. But that would probably fall into a discussion that the chairman brought up that you may wish to undertake separately, and we could certainly give you some thoughts and background upon that. As I say, we work very closely with the council, and we're very grateful for the support that we have from the council and with the water companies. And the Environment Agency, our partners, certainly on the operations side, understand the frustrations we all share, but have their hands tied, and many of them have to step well outside the procedures and what's allowed for us to ensure that the water levels are managed properly within these IDB areas. And we're grateful for their efforts. Robert's going to whisk you through the impact that the storms had on some of our systems, and then the chairman's going to give you some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. If you jump to page 64 in the pack, it's the first photographs. that were on the presentation. This is Huxterwell Pumping Station. It is located just south of the M18, north of Rosington, near the airport. It pumps and manages water that comes from the airport catchment, the M18 motorway, and had some alterations from the Finningley and Rosington regeneration route. The amount of water that's now received at that pumping station is quite significant. So we're working with the iPort to improve storage within the catchment and looking for improvements at the station. During the storms through the winter months, the floodwater there was elevated and putting pressure on the motorway embankment for up to 14 days before we'd recovered levels back. Moving on to page 65 in the main pack is Elmhurst Pumping Station. This is up in the Thorn and Moor Ends area. It's in the Isle of Axholme Flood Risk Management Strategy area. Whilst the photographs there show large areas of agricultural land flooding, this also impacted the discharges from the Thorn and Moor Ends areas, which caused some localised issues. As part of the Isle of Axholme strategy, we're working with the Trent Area Environment Agency with looking at the Environment Agency New Zealand pumping station and the Medge Hall pumping station, which is a board one, to look at the catchment and how we can better protect 700 properties in Thorn and Moor Ends. Moving over to page 66, Medge Hall pumping station that I've just mentioned will be part of that scheme. It sits alongside Thorn Moors and suffers from overtopping from the River Torn and North Soak systems. Page 67, Tick Hill pumping station. This is in the lowland area next to the River Torn. It suffers from overtopping from the River Torn during the events. We lost access to the station for 4 days. This increases the impact of surface water flooding across the A1 and on the discharges out of Tick Hill, increasing the risk of flooding in the urban area. So we're looking at solutions there. Moving on to page 69, 70. As mentioned, there's an additional 75 million that's been made available to help IDBs recover from the recent flood events and modernise their infrastructure. This has been split into two blocks. Storm recovery, which looks at the events between October and March to help drainage boards recover from the additional costs and to repair some assets. And then asset improvements, which is a £50 million pot that looks to the modernisation and upgrade of IDB assets, waterways, to improve flood resilience to farm businesses and rural communities. The Doncaster East Board has made applications to both the storm recovery and the asset improvement funds. The storm recovery application total was £266,500, which it might not seem a lot, but that's around 20% of the revenue that the board raises from agricultural rates and special levies. So it's quite a significant proportion, and if we weren't able to secure that storm recovery money, it would have an impact on the rates going forward. The storm recovery represents repair for damage at 13 pumping stations that we saw and replacement of some damaged pump and equipment. In tranche 2, which is the asset improvement, we have made an application and bid for £1.1 million worth of work to improve systems in the Doncaster East area. Those systems, if we go to page 73 in the pack, is the Tick Hill catchment, which I previously mentioned suffered during the event. This looks at improving water storage in catchment and more resilience to Tick Hill pumping station. to enable flows out of Tickhill and off the A1 to be stored in the lowland and accommodate some of the effects of the River Torn overtopping. We're also looking at Killam Farm to Candy Farm catchment. This is within the Isle of Axholme strategy. It's a watercourse that runs from Orkley through to Root on the north side of the River Torn, sorry. And along that watercourse, there are 3 pumping stations. Now, the improvements to the watercourse would enable us to, in the future, rationalise and reduce the number of pumping stations along that channel that provide the same service. So it's part of the long-term Isle of Axholme strategy flood risk management. It will help take and convey water that floods out of the River Torn back to stations that are more capable of putting it back into the river and improve the rural area there. On page 77, we've also applied for funding for a number of water level monitoring sites to be installed across the catchment. This will enable us to have a better view of what's happening and to deploy resources effectively. Whilst the Doncaster East Board covers 23,000 hectares, 300 kilometres of watercourse, 24 pumping stations, we have 1.5 employees that are out on the ground. So making best use of that deployment of resource will have a huge impact on local communities. Moving forward, we also have some capital schemes that are ongoing, and one of the major ones is Park Drain Pumping Station. Park Drain Pumping Station is one of the largest pumping stations in the Doncaster East Board area. It is due its major refurbishment in 2025-26. It's part of the Isle of Axholme strategy and looks at rationalisation and removes some of the smaller pumping stations within its catchment, with some improvements at the station and watercourse alterations. The estimated cost of this work is 2.6 million, and the business case is currently being prepared to support the application for flood defence granting aid, which will cover the majority at 2.45 is what we've got an outline allocation for. The catchment area, whilst it sits close to westward side, it protects Finningley, the airport, and it takes water from the back of Mount Pleasant area and brings it across the lowland. And that's it for the projects, Chris, if you want.
Yeah, and I said enough about the funding. The interesting thing about the catchment is, you just heard, the airport in Finningley, it goes out as far as Tickhill. We've still got drains that run between Stainforth and Thorn, which are within a stone's throw of the Don, but the water can't go to the Don from our catchment. The system was designed back in the mist of time. And the water from Doncaster, a lot of it, the bulk of it should go into the Don, but the water from our catchment ends up in the Trent at Keighley, and that's some miles to go. So it goes through other boards areas as well. And people don't, when Andrew said about everything looks normal, but it actually isn't, to get the water from the edge of Doncaster as a town, as a city now, all the way to Keighley, it's got to be pumped 2 or 3 times. It's got to be pumped that way and kept going that way because of the levels, because the land has all been recovered from marshland. We've got the same issue down where the airport is. That used to be marshland. So there's a lot of recovered land in Doncaster, and then you've got the legacy of the coal. So it's quite a complicated catchment all round, as Ben mentioned earlier. And that's it, I think. Oh, one last point. I must make this point. The Recovery and Asset Improvement Fund, the 75 million that was set one side. Unfortunately, I've got slides at home which show this. I went to a meeting at Bawtry Hall some weeks ago, and the NFU showed us the initial criteria. Ben, you might not be aware of this at all, but the initial criteria for that fund said that it could only apply to damage that was done for a 10-day period in January, and we'd had 10 storms over the winter between October, November, right through to February. but civil servants decided it would be a 10-day period in January. How quite they'd know which storm the water came from. But the other point they made is the work had to be necessary and be done within 100 metres of the centre of the river. And in our case, the tidal trend was 1.5 miles wide when they came up with that. Fortunately, within days, that disappeared. But the fact that somebody sitting in an office somewhere could come up with a criteria for funding that started with those two measurements, which in effect rendered it completely useless, is just mind-blowing. There you go. I mean, if it was on the television, you wouldn't believe it, would you? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I know we've got a couple of questions and I'm sure there'll be some after as well. Okay, Councillor Debbie Hutchinson, you have the first question.
Yes, thank you, Robert, for your presentation, and Paul. So you've probably touched on some of it, but I'll ask the question. How are water levels within drainage districts managed to balance flood risk reduction and environmental conservation?
Well, we have our own environmental officer, and we have a statutory obligation to protect and enhance the environment. So whilst it may look that some of our works that we undertake are quite intrusive within the watercourse in order to keep the channel operating for its primary function, which is to convey water, we do actually take into account the environment, and we tend to, for instance, flail one side of a watercourse and try and alternate that each year so that fresh habitat comes in, if that's at all possible. We have environmental record monitoring, which is now electronic, and we have thousands of records to show population growth in things such as water voles. We invest in charities that put up owl boxes. All of these sorts of things we undertake to ensure that and we also undertake mitigation work. So if we use concrete somewhere, we have to find an offset somewhere else. So it's pretty well balanced. We try not to allow watercourses to dry out. We have a summer level and a winter level, but we do take water levels down because we keep the silt down to a minimum level within them so that we can evacuate water effectively before a storm arrives.
I'll just add to that on the water levels that are set and the pumping stations. That's based on modelled data to provide standards of service within catchment. So we start with what levels we need, and then there's modifications to the watercourse to ensure that there's adequate wetted habitat, and it promotes a effective flood protection and environmental benefits.
Okay, thank you. Next question I think comes from Councillor James Church.
What strategies are put in place to ensure that riparian landowners maintain the banks from, for instance, being overgrown or from rubbish and stuff like that? What strategies do you have in place to ensure that they're kept in order?
Well, the board has, within the board's area, the board would take enforcement action if there was injury being caused by a riparian drain to another person. So, for instance, if two landowners, if one drain, or house owners, if the drain ran from one to the other and the person downstream had not been maintaining the watercourse and it was backing up, as an example, and causing flooding or injury to that other individual, we could act in order. So we would write to them, meet with them, ask them to undertake the work, and if they refuse to do that, we would go and undertake the work and then send them the bill and recover the monies that way. Outside of the board area and the hydraulic catchment, it's the council's responsibility or the Environment Agency. It's a sort of, depending on the actual situation. There are booklets. We brought one along when I saw your question. This is a Lincolnshire County Council one. I'm not certain if Doncaster have their own one, but you probably do. If not, I'll leave a copy with this, but it shows the rights and responsibilities of riparian owners. So our planning and bylaws teams go out and they enforce this within the drain watercourses, but the board's watercourses, but also within riparian owners' watercourses within the board's area.
So, David, you've got a question.
Thank you. You've spoken a lot, and you've got a lot of pumping stations. Are they all electrically powered? And when some of these stations get overtopped and water levels rise, obviously electricity and water don't mix. So how is that organised so that they don't get inundated?
All of the Doncaster East pumping stations are electrically powered. The stations that are more prone to inundation or being cut off have had remedial works to raise electrical equipment outside of the expected flood level. I mentioned Killam Farm and Candy Farm, Killam Farm and Tonbridge pumping station. They come under regular inundation, and if you go in there, the panels on the very top third of the wall outside of the flood area. Huxterwell pumping station, one of the other ones I showed a photo, that's on pedestals outside. Where you want your pumping equipment is the most likely area that the flood water is going to congregate. So when we're undertaking design and resilience measures, we account for expected exceedance events.
Any other questions from the panel? Yes, Councillor Thomas-May.
Thank you. Can you just explain a bit why water can't be pumped into Don? Is this due to the flood risk connected to Don? And is it lowering the river that the water ends up in? And how far has that got to travel?
It's not that it can't, it's just that the hydraulic catchments that the Doncaster East Board look after have been designed to go to the River Torn and ultimately the River Trent. There are 2 fields and 1 row of houses that actually go to the Don, but through the Dagenham Drainage Board. Now, the Dagenham Drainage Board and Black Drain Drainage Boards do discharge into the River Don.
Could I just add also, this is not unusual. If I was to take you across the East Lindsey District, yes, and the Lindsey Marsh Drainage Board, there's a river called the River Steeping, and there's a board one side that takes the water all south towards the Wash, and then there's Lindsey Marsh, which takes it out into the North Sea. These systems are artificial. This is the thing. These are artificial systems being built to do certain things. And if you were looking at harmonising anything, you'd be looking at bringing Doncaster East IDB and Isle of Axum IDB into one unit eventually, maybe in 10 years or so or beyond, but because that's where the water flows naturally in that direction. But remember, these are artificially made areas.
It just, some of it was designed and built, especially north of Thorn, by Vermeulen. That's how long ago. The system was put in place a hell of a long time ago to do. It was just, in Vermeulen's case, he was given the job of draining certain areas of land to the northeast of Doncaster. And his reward for that was he was given pieces and chunks of it. But he did it in the easiest way they could with the equipment that they had. But it basically, he designed a whole new system, which is, that's why the Don, near the Don up north of Thorn, the huge wide section disappears towards Humber, known as the Dutch River. It's, except the name, actual name, it's named after Vermeulen, it's the Dutch River.
Do we think the systems and how they was built back then are still fit for purpose now, or do we need to look at whole new infrastructure change and stuff, or is it just bigger pumping stations and stuff like that?
For instance, the Isle of Axum strategy did a fair bit of what you're suggesting by looking at, if you go onto the internet, you'll find the area which it covers, and Doncaster and Isle of Axum were in that. And I think it was about £4.4 billion worth of infrastructure was identified by the agency as being protected by these systems that exist now. The investment to redo it completely would be colossal. I mean, what we've got, we can barely maintain with regard to the funding rules, particularly as a lot of it runs through rural communities. So you get money to maintain bits of it, but not all of it. The Isle of Axum strategy looked to rationalise the systems and to modify it and reduce the number of pumping stations if we could actually use more efficient systems which now exist, or approaches, in bigger pumping stations. So we could take them out and the long-term costs would then reduce. But to redo it wholesale would require significant investment. However, with the change in weather patterns that we're seeing and the rising sea levels, that type of thinking needs to be started. And I think some of that's been covered in the Humber strategy now. It's a challenging environment.
It does bring up another subject, which is rationalisation of assets. And the EA, some 12 years ago, started on, they call it rationalisation of assets, and other people called it asset transfer, where it went to a different owner. And they came up, for example, in this area with 7 pumping stations they thought would be best managed by the IDB. And it was very rushed, and it didn't go through, and it stopped. The EA are going to be looking again, they've said, both the new chairman and the new chief exec have said they're going to look at rationalisation. That is something people will need to look at really closely. Of the 7 pumps at the time, they actually wanted to transfer them within a matter of months, but it was shelved after some discussion. One of them is a pump that runs on diesel. There's 2 pumps in a building that runs on diesel. And there's a plaque on the wall because they replaced, and they're still there, they replaced the steam-driven pumps that were there when it was built. And this is a Grade 2 listed building in the middle of nowhere that it's big enough to be a small snooker hole. And of course it's prone to vandalism. And my suggestion to them was, what could possibly go wrong? And then you have to make parts for those pumps. You can't go out and buy bits off the shelf to keep them running. You've got to make the parts. So it's stuff like that. If we're going to rationalise them, there has to be a business case for each of those assets. Because, as I say, our money comes from the council tax. We set a levy, and it's subsumed into the council tax. And while police and parish and town councils are identified in the council tax bill, we're not in there, which is unusual. But if we simply just take pump after pump after pump, as you've heard about the state of all the assets, and the National Audit Office say the assets generally aren't in good nick or acceptable nick, as the bulk of them aren't actually in that state, you'd need to be careful locally what your role was in the rationalisation and who ultimately will fund the continuation of running of those pumps.
Could I just very quickly just add, in there we are putting a lot of fresh water out to sea. And I think our colleagues from Yorkshire Water, and certainly if you look at Water Resources East, again, if you were to put that into the internet and have a look at see what they're undertaking across on the East Coast, how to store water, how to make better use of it in the future as the demands increase, I think that's another massive part of the jigsaw.
Thank you. Councillor Ian Pearson, do you have a question? That's all.
Thank you, Chair. I've assumed all along that you are actually a consultee in all planning applications. Why is it that everything you've just said we've known about for years, but I've never seen a planning application that says the actions taken by this development will cause overtopping, damage to soakaways, or will need to see, something the size of 10 football pitches for storage of water, and the equipment that you've got, and I appreciate the diesels and what have you, in this day and age is not fit for purpose. You mentioned about going out to third parties, but I've never actually seen anybody put that warning in writing for any business development, the airport or anything like that, and no comment about what happens the other way around. When the Dutch came and did all of the dikes, nobody ever says in the planning application, you're filling in natural runoffs that were put in by the Dutch, and therefore you're now going to have flooding and return to marshland because the 300-year-old open ditch has gone. You comment about the pipe that goes down to the Severn and what have you. Again, we never see anything in planning applications about introducing new flow-offs into other areas or going back into the Don and out to the Humber in the planning applications. Is it not your need and requirement to get that message out for your own funding for the future? Thank you, Chair.
I'm glad you asked that question, Ian, because when I was the Cabinet Member for the Environment up to 3 years ago, we arranged here in Doncaster that case officers for planning applications would consult the IDBs. I'm not entirely sure, I have to say, Dan, that's continued to this day, and certainly not with all planning case officers. Nationally, legally, IDBs are not statutory consultees, so technically a planning authority, such as this one, doesn't have to consult, which is...
However, our process, we have a development control team. It's made up of 3 people that look after 4 boards. On a weekly basis, we trawl the planning lists in all councils. I think we look at 11 districts, planning authorities, and make representations as we can under the Land Drainage Act for inflows into board systems or alterations in catchment. We are fairly restrictive in what we can accept into pumped catchments, and whilst there has been some changes, because of how the pumping stations were sized, we only accept 1.4 litres per second per hectare, which is quite a small discharge rate. That being said, when you move from a greenfield area to an urbanised area, you will generally see 50 to 60% more water discharged into those systems, even if it's attenuated over time. You get more developments, we actually see more volumetric discharge going through our stations. So we do make representations, but they are limited to what we can reasonably comment under the Land Drainage Act.
Wouldn't it be better, rather than have people trolling through planning applications to see if there's one that's relevant to the board, if the planning case officers routinely, when they go to Yorkshire Water, Severn and Trent, the Coal Authority, town and parish councils and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, just put IDBs on the list where they're in existence?
It makes sense too, but I was going to say, we are looking to have a further meeting, online meeting with the drainage boards, because we are aware that like some of them are not here today, so we will organise that, and there might be a further discussion for us to have separately at that meeting. But thank you very much. I'm conscious of time, so we'll move on. But I was just also say, you mentioned about the Isle of Axum strategy and a couple of others. If you could share that with us, that would be fantastic, so it gives an opportunity for us to look into that in detail, and maybe again we'll have that discussion when we have that online meeting arranged. Okay, so yes, quickly.
Very quickly on the Isle of Axum flood risk management strategy, the surface water elements that may be appropriate for Doncaster Council were actually removed from the strategy, so there are benefits available to be claimed for surface water schemes, but we'll share the strategy.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Yorkshire Water.
Thank you. We'll just wait for the slides to come up. Fingers crossed. Okay, I'll start talking and then the pressure is off slightly. So yeah, thanks for having us along today. Connected by Water is a partnership of all local authorities in South Yorkshire, and that obviously includes Doncaster, along with the combined mayoral authority, the Environment Agency and ourselves, Yorkshire Water. There's a number of colleagues in the room today who would equally be able to give this presentation, and they're key members of our partnership. And we've covered an awful lot of really relevant ground today, so lots of important topics that we've touched on. I'll fast forward through certain bits of the presentation that I think we've already covered, and I know you've got some questions when we get to the end. Although we each wear individual organisational labels during our day jobs, we are very much engaged in the same challenge, which is increasing flood resilience for the communities in which we live, and that sits at the heart of what Connected by Water is striving to achieve. And so today, although I'm speaking on behalf of Yorkshire Water, I also am speaking on behalf of the Connected by Water Partnership. I sit on the steering group along with David Snell. David retires this week, I think it is, and Phil is going to be stepping in onto that partnership role. And then we report into a CEO meeting. So the CEOs from the organisations meet every 6 months, and for governance purposes, we report directly into that meeting.
As I'm going through the slides today, I'll talk about connected by water in its broadest sense, but I'll try and focus in on the specific elements that are really relevant to yourselves and Doncaster. So this slide is really a summary of how the partnership came to be, the journey that we've been on so far, and then it emphasises the core elements of our approach, which you can see in that Venn diagram on the right-hand side. So we've talked already today about the need for a catchment-wide approach, and when we talk about the catchment, we mean our water catchments. So we're particularly interested here in the South Yorkshire area that tips into Derbyshire with the River Don and Rother. We're interested in all types of flooding. So there are, although on the diagram that Adam showed right at the start, you can see the different responsibilities that we have as individual organisations. Collectively, we're interested in all types of flooding. So whether it's, river water flooding, surface water flooding, sewer flooding, the impacts of climate change that we've already mentioned a couple of times today has the potential to make that flooding worse. And so we're really looking at covering all types. A couple of statistics, but 3 in 5 people living in flood risk areas don't know they're at risk. So there's an immediate opportunity there. And I know that we've talked about the flood warnings process. We've got over 27,000 properties in South Yorkshire that are in a flood warning area. And that's areas that are in low-lying land where we expect flooding to occur. So some really, really big numbers there. We are tackling this through a partnership, and as Adam and Ben have both outlined, we do each have our individual remits, but on top of those, this is where we come together to pool resource and expertise to make sure that we can successfully address the whole risk. We look to how we can layer individual schemes together to get bigger benefit so that we can overcome some of the challenges that Ben talked about with some of the funding processes. We see partnership as an opportunity for overcoming that. So this map on the screen now just talks to the catchments for the River Don and Rother and Dearne that I mentioned before. So the green outline is the political boundaries, and as we know from certainly last autumn and winter, but we've suffered from a succession of big floods, and that water doesn't respect any political boundaries or water company boundaries. It goes where hydraulically it wants. So we can't view that in isolation. It's part of a much bigger interconnected system. And that's why our chief executives, when they met last week, they all committed to continuing to do the work of this partnership, making sure that we can deliver the right outcomes for the region's communities, the businesses, and encouraging that economic development. And then obviously the environment as well in which we live and all enjoy. So just to sort of touch on a few elements that are particularly relevant. So we are in a unique opportunity now. We're talking about how we can start to bring together the strategy of this interconnected water management system. You talked a moment ago about water resources. And we apply labels on water, whether it's storm water, raw water, flood water. It's all just water. Sometimes it's in the right place, sometimes it's in the wrong place, and that's because that's how we've defined it. The opportunity is looking at how we manage the system to make sure that we continue to prosper as a community. So making sure that we've got the water in the right place for drinking, and making sure that we've got the water in the right place so that it's not flooding properties. And as a partnership, we're coming together and maturing around that, around what that means for us. We've got good political support in the region. So Mayor Coppard, this was in his election manifesto, and with the election that's just taken place, the general election, we've got Emma Hardy from Hull, who is the new Minister for Water, and in that constituency in Hull, we also have another very successful and mature partnership called Living with Water that has very similar aims as the Connected by Water partnership, and it looks to achieve those aims in the City of Hull. So really, really good support for what we're trying to do. It is important that we continue to collaborate. So, you know, we can individually access pots of money, and we've got examples of schemes where we've done that. When we come together, we're a much stronger unit, and we can present a much stronger case for that interconnected water management system. And we've got some good examples recently where we've applied to the Yorkshire Resilience Flood and Coastal Committee for funding to support the partnership. Okay, conscious of time. We'll get into some of the what have we actually delivered. So this slide talks about just a selection of the successes that we've delivered to date. I guess since it's the creation of the partnership, we've been very much focused on coming together, maturing, looking at opportunities where we can collaborate on schemes, delivering some of those, but also with an eye to the future in terms of creating a pipeline of projects and initiatives that continue to build resilience into the communities. So the partnership is new, but that said, we have delivered some really significant interventions. The first one is the local levy funding that we've been able to secure from the Yorkshire Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. Now that's a key nod of support from the committee, and it's allowed us to secure additional resources on top of the resources that we each bring to bear as individual partners. We've been able to secure funding for more resources to focus on how we start to bring together this joined up scheme of activity and then invest across the whole South Yorkshire region to deliver those outcomes and aims. I know Ben talked about the Source to Sea project that's led by the Environment Agency. You know, that's a key approach that looks to utilise nature-based solutions in the Upper Don area to slow the flow. So keeping the water up in the upper catchments so that it slowly comes down through those urban areas and reduces the peak of those floods. Again, when we talk about water resources, there's key benefits to keeping the water in the uplands as well. There is a new tool, so the development of the investment tool that the EA are creating. So at the moment, when we sit and look at investment opportunities as individual organisations, we're limited by the number of discussions we can have. The idea behind the tool is we can each put our forward plans into the tool and then see where there could be opportunities to collaborate more specifically. And I know we'll touch on a few examples of that in a slide or two's time. But this is really a great opportunity for mining out where we think there's the option to support, whether it's the Environment Agency or Doncaster specifically, on individual schemes that will help to deliver the aims of the partnership. Around about a year ago, we all got together in a room in Sheffield and we developed a partnership maturity assessment, and that was really around what is the strategic intent of the partnership, how do we want that to mature over the coming year, 5 years, 10 years, and deliver the aims. And that was a really important session in terms of creating that roadmap for the future. Huge and important piece that we're engaged in is the education and awareness raising. So we've already talked about people not realising they are at risk of flooding. We've developed a bespoke Key Stage 2 lesson for primary school children, and we've delivered that so far to around about 300 students. We deliver that in partnership. Doncaster has benefited. There have been a number of schools, Castle Hill School, Carcroft and Travis St Lawrence, and we're offering that out to more and more schools, and that's all with a view to educating those children. They get information about climate change, but this is the real practical details of how to understand what to do in a flood situation and how to protect yourselves and your family. And then we've got the dashboard that we are rolling out. So this is a local authority-led flood risk dashboard. And it works across the catchment, and it's just to provide that more visual and user-friendly information about whether you are at flood risk or not.
And that's been a key piece of work undertaken by the City of Doncaster Council. So oops, I need to move this on. You might have heard about DIG, so Doncaster, Immingham and Grimsby Surface Water Resilience Project. This is the culmination of 3 years of work, really. It's our first truly partnership delivered outcome through Connected by Water, and it's seen us secure £6.7 million worth of DEFRA funding to spend across 4 sites. So 4 sites each secured £1 million, and then there's £2.7 million that we're spending on some of the research and the modelling work that needs to be done, and then a big piece of engagement with the communities in which we're working. The approach here is installing some retrofit sustainable drainage features so that we can tackle surface water runoff in urban areas. We talked a moment ago about the impact of urbanising areas that previously used to have free drainage and the impact that has on surface water and the generation of more surface water. So this is to combat some of that. So by retrofitting these sustainable drainage features, again, we want to reduce or increase the level of flood resilience in those areas. It's also key that we bring along the communities and that they have input into those projects, because ultimately this is something that will sit with them. It will help protect them from future flooding events, and we very much see this as something that once we've established it as an approach, we'll be able to take forward and roll out to more areas. Okay, so I've talked a lot about some of the points on here. So I guess just to highlight again, the key aim is around increasing that flood resilience for the communities, and I've touched on education a few times. We're all living in a more extreme climate. We got very wet on the way here today, and now it looks like it's going to be red hot when I leave. So we're seeing those fluctuations in almost every day. And just helping our children and younger people understand how to live with that and to cope with that helps, and they can then take those lessons back and help family members in the home to understand that as well. So this map shows Scorthorpe and around the Castle Hill School area where we did the education lesson, and this is just one of the sort of practical examples of what we're actually doing. So the permeable paving is going to be installed in the green areas, and then some of the SUDs, the sustainable drainage features, will be installed in the blue areas. And then the words on the right-hand side, I guess, that highlights a lot of the activity and investigation work that needs to take place to support the delivery of the actual project. And I know Ben commented earlier on how complex some of this can be and the time that it takes. So, it isn't a case of just turning up and deciding we're going to do a sustainable drainage feature. There's an awful lot of activity, modelling, understanding the existing assets and the interconnectivity of the hydrology between the new asset and the existing. The worst case scenario would be that we put a new scheme in place that actually increases the flood risk, which is something we don't want to see. And then this slide just talks specifically about a project where Yorkshire Water and Doncaster have worked directly together. So the photos there are a Rossholme surface water pumping station, and that was a site where we did some extensive refurbishments. So the top photo is it before, the bottom photo is it after, and that upgrade was to improve the flood resilience in the area. We've also seen work together, clearing out drainage ditches and installation of new equipment, such as the flat valve there, that again just helps to protect the areas better from future rainfall events. And then again, just highlighting some of the work really in the schools. So you can see in the centre there we've got one of the planters that we've developed. We do a lot of work through the Living with Water partnership with Hull University, and they have developed lots of tools that demonstrate the effectiveness of even things as small as planters and water butts. So just a little bit of storage can help improve the sort of slow the flow methodology and stops that water entering the drainage network. So yeah, what appears like a small intervention can actually deliver quite large local benefits. Okay, so that was connected by water. I've also got another slide, I think. Yeah, which just talks more specifically about what Yorkshire Water are doing in Doncaster, specifically with regard to our drainage duties. So we are spending a lot through this investment period. This investment period is called AMP7. It runs from 2020 to 2025. And in that investment period, we have our Water Industry National Environment Programme, the WINEP programme, that is seeing us invest around about £229 million to improve something like 340 kilometres worth of the River Don and its tributary systems. So a big investment in our treatment works, looking at installing more nutrient removal from wastewater assets and discharges, and that's all focused on in achieving an improved level of river water quality. We've also got a programme of investment in storm overflows. So storm overflows is something that we see talked about a lot in the media now. When we came into this investment cycle, storm overflows already existed. They just weren't really commonly understood or talked about. So around a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago, we looked at how we could invest across Yorkshire an additional £180 million to remove the impact of around about 20% of our storm overflow discharges. And we're seeing that investment, well, it's really starting to happen now. So we've got sites every week. It seems like there's new sites being announced and schemes coming through to delivery. We've got 5 sites in Doncaster, so they're ongoing at the moment. So 5 of those 130. And as we step into the next investment period that starts in 2025, we're just in the discussions with the regulator, the economic regulator Ofwat, about the level of investment we'll be allowed to do in that 5-year period. We've applied for funding of around about £1.2 billion to invest in 250 storm overflows, and that'll see us reduce the impact of our overflows even further, which is obviously the right thing to do. So that was all the slides I had. So I'll click the button.
Thank you very much. I know we've got some questions. Councillor Debbie Hutchinson, you've got the first question again.
Thank you for your presentation. What improvements have been made to manage the risk of flooding from sewerage systems, and how effective have these measures been in recent high volume storm events?
Thank you. Yeah, so we have two sort of approaches that we talk about. So we have our and I think we've heard some of this today as well. So we have a maintenance approach, which is where we'll go out and we will check and inspect equipment. We'll check and inspect sewers, whether they're foul sewers, combined sewers, or surface water sewers, and we'll check and inspect things like pumping stations as well. And we'll invest in keeping those maintained so that they are free flowing. So we'll do things like root cutting. We'll line sewers where roots have ingressed into the sewers. We'll cut the roots out and we'll line those to relife them. And then we'll maintain equipment. On top of that, we have some of the sort of enhancement type activities where we'll look to invest in a greater level of protection. So whether that's because of the impacts of climate change or just the need to protect to a higher standard, we'll deliver schemes like the pumping station that we talked about there on the slide, and other specifics that'll exist across the catchment. But yeah, there'll be a range of different schemes that we'll look to deliver.
Thank you. Councillor Emma Mudderman-Rawlins, have you got a question?
Hi. How do water authorities work with developers to ensure that the developments incorporate effective flood management measures? Get my teeth in.
Thank you. So, yeah, I know we talked about this a little moment ago, and it's a really important area. So, we're not a statutory consultee either. We do comment on planning. There are certain protections and controls that developers have to abide by. So, separate surface water and foul systems. They have to attenuate flow on their sites. They have to incorporate sustainable drainage. But yeah, this is particularly with the announcement of much more housing to come, I think this is a key area that that collectively we all need to double down on and make sure is right. So yeah, there are existing approaches in place, but I think it's something that definitely needs a revisit and a relook to make sure that we're not creating another legacy of new developments that has a problem for generations to come.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question next. How are you working to reduce the effects of combined sewer overflows into the rivers? Obviously, that's been of national debate quite recently.
Yeah, so this is a huge piece of the focus for us at the moment. So we operate a largely combined sewer network. That's not the case for all water companies. Some water companies have much more separated systems, but in the north, so for Yorkshire Water, United Utilities and Northumbrian Water, we have the highest proportion of storm overflows. Yorkshire Water, we have over 2,000 storm overflows, and they're a passive pressure relief valve on the combined network. So when it rains, the combined sewer fills up, and to protect properties from flooding, that discharges to a watercourse, and those discharges are permitted, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily always have an impact on the environment. So a lot of the debate recently is focused on moving away from that as a feature and as a type of asset. So yeah, we have a plan to reduce the number of CSOs that spill to the environment or discharge to the environment. That's set down in something called the Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan. It's a plan that means we will have to reduce over each investment period. We'll reduce incrementally. So we've got a lot of them. They're expensive to deal with, and we'll I think by 2035 we'll have had to reduce the number of discharges by something like 75%. There's actually a map that we've recently published, so it's called the discharge storm overflow discharge map, and it's a real-time map that you can go on, log on to, and see in real time in your local area or anywhere in Yorkshire if a discharge has occurred recently or if one's occurring right now. In fact, there's a number of approaches. The key approach that we will look to prioritise every time is, can we separate the surface water out of the combined system? So the surface water is what causes the discharge to occur. All of that extra rainfall overwhelms the system, and if we can take that out and put that into a surface water sewer, or create a new surface water sewer, or put it into a sustainable drainage solution that ultimately discharges to a river, then that's what we'll seek to do. In the worst case, we end up building storage tanks. So you sort of see, and that, at the moment we are building quite a lot of storage tanks. They're quick and relatively easy to do. They sterilise the land that they sit underneath, but we'll build a tank, and then that can store the excess rainwater, which we then pump back into the sewer at a time when the sewer can receive it, and then we treat that through the treatment works. So yeah, there's a couple of options. There is a lot of investment going in, and that's to achieve that storm overflow discharge reduction plan target.
Okay, thank you. And did you say that was an online? Anyone can access the information?
Yeah. If you Google a certain phrase.
Is it the storm overflow discharge reduction plan you wanted to look at, or the map? The plan? So the plan is a government plan, so you can view that on the government's website. Just search Storm Overflow Discharge Reduction Plan, and that will come up. I think it was published 2022 by Minister Powell. And then the Storm Overflow map, if you Google Yorkshire Water Storm Overflow map, that'll come up. But I can also send you some links after this.
That'd be helpful. Thank you. And then I'm going back to Councillor Debbie Hutchinson for your next question.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So talking about cracked pipes, like in residential areas, how long does it take to prioritise and repair them when residents are suffering with raw sewage keep coming up quite frequently?
So if there's a specific, that'd be good to know about it, and then we can look into the details, I guess, from a more general answer. So we have a processes for prioritising the different types of work that come through. So if there's a cracked pipe that's leading to someone's property flooding, that's up there as the most serious thing we'll deal with, alongside pollution. So yeah, then we would be sending someone out to that straight away. So they'd be going to inspect it, they'd be going to look to see what was the immediate cause, and then they'd be going to work out what remedial work was needed. Most of the time, the problem is caused by things like wet wipes. So the majority, and it's a really high percentage of blockages, are caused by wet wipes in the system. And there's work that has been long spoken about in terms of banning wet wipes and the use of them. That's still not in place, and it's something that would be really good to actually finally get over the line. When there is a problem that needs fixing, then that would be scheduled to make sure that it was done in a timely manner to prevent it reoccurring. But yeah, if there is there a specific one that you're thinking about?
Sorry, it went on for years, and his wife has an health problem, so
Right.
it were affecting her really bad.
Yeah, so that doesn't sound like the right length of time.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to pass the example over, and then we can look into what's gone on and why. And we do continuously look at how we can improve the sort of the less glamorous side. That's the process that we follow internally to make sure that when we understand there's a problem, we get someone there quickly and keep customers updated. Because yeah, not at all nice to be in that situation.
Just to add to that as well, I will pass the corporate affairs team, which is the team I'm part of, details over to the chair to circulate with yourselves, and we're the point of contact for councillors, MPs, council officers as well. So if you do have cases like that that are coming through to you, please do direct them straight to the corporate affairs team, and we can address them for you.
Thank you, that's appreciated as well. Okay, Councillor Devon Everett, you have a question.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned about clean water discharge into the sea. Is this a good thing or a bad? Why is it an issue? And the Doncaster sandstone aquifer is fed by seepage. How is this affected by the increased rain?
So I think when you talk about clean water discharges to the sea, are you talking about the through the rivers and the drainage network? Yeah. So that ultimately the natural environment is that water falls as rain and discharges through to the sea. I think what was perhaps being identified there is the opportunity to look at how we treat this system. So we have as Yorkshire Water, we're obviously really interested in quite a large part of the water cycle. So we want to protect the raw water sources so that we can use that as drinking water for customers. And we want to make sure that we've got enough of that. And when we look into the future, we see the impact of climate change and housing growth being that we will actually, as a region, go into a situation where we don't have enough water. So we're working on how we can make sure that the actions we take today build capacity into our systems for the future. I think the next part of that cycle is when we actually get to I guess taking away the rainwater and the wastewater, and ultimately that does go into the sea. But regardless of where rainwater falls, it still has the potential to, whether it's recharge of groundwater for aquifer supply, and we obviously take aquifer water in the south or in Doncaster for drinking water, or whether it's supplementing the sort of abstraction in other areas. So we compensate abstraction with discharges of water so that the environment can continue to thrive. And I guess the challenge is just making sure that in the changing climate and environment that we work in, nothing stays the same for very long.
just making sure that we've got visibility of all of that water in its different forms and that we're making the right choices of where to put that for the good of customers and the environment. Hopefully that was yeah, that may have made sense. Apologies if I didn't.
Okay, thank you. So conscious of time, I know Councillor Thomas Noon's going to ask questions. Does anyone else want to ask a question before we start moving on to the final mix of panel questions? Okay, Councillor Thomas Noon.
Thank you. I've got two.
And Ian as well.
It's been mentioned already today across all agencies about the age of equipment, etc. Is this the same for Yorkshire Water, and has it been budgeted to bring the ageing pipe work up to level and standard required with the increase in population and house building?
So the we have our business planning process operates every 5 years, and we'll look to agree a rate of base maintenance, which is the replacement of existing infrastructure, and then the new infrastructure, so that the enhancement that we want to do. The level of base maintenance funding that we are allocated it targets a certain rate of replacement, and this we've had challenge with Ofwat over successive investment periods about the level of funding we're provided. Yorkshire as a region, we do need to invest in replacing things like water supply pipes and sewers, and we have had what we would say is one of the lowest rates of funding across all of the water sector for that pipe renewal rate. At the moment, we're in discussions with Ofwat as part of our what we call the draft determination return. We'll be sending that in at the end of August, and as part of that return, we are seeking to raise the right amount of money to replace more pipes. It's not a quick solution. This is a long-term asset management investment strategy, so we might replace something like 5% of our pipes in an investment period, with a view to replacing them all over, say, 50 to 100 years. But yeah, that is the strategy that we've got.
And just one more following on for what got said earlier. So you've said a 75% reduction in waste into our rivers over the next 11 years, and we've got, is it 2,000 overflows, did you say? Do you know how many overflow or leak spillages that we've had into the rivers in the last couple of years?
So we do report very recently, over the last couple of years, there's been a rollout of something called an event duration monitor. So the event duration monitor is a device that sits on the end of an overflow, and it tells you whether the overflow is operating. So we report that data annually to the Environment Agency. And that is then available. There's information that you can download, and that'll tell you exactly how many overflows operate. We have something like, the number is not going to be accurate, but we have something in the order of 2,500 CSOs, and each one of those, on average, will operate somewhere between 30 to 40 times a year, is what the data shows us. We've got, we've just gone through, I think the last year we reported at where 100% of our overflows were monitored. So it's taken time to get to the position where all overflows are now monitored. But what we're seeing is, we're seeing obviously the impact of rainfall on those overflows. So in the dry year that was 2022, the overflows operated for a lower amount of times. In the wet year, conversely, they operated more. We have a baseline year, and then we're going to be reducing against that baseline year to make sure that we hit that Environment Act target and storm overflow discharge reduction plan.
Okay, and Councillor Ian Pearson, you have the last question.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions that all run together, really. My understanding is you've got outflows of sewage or foul, something like 2,000 times a day from the figures that were published. So you mentioned about the monitoring. Is that information that was put out by the government fairly accurate now that you're fully monitoring? And following from that, you're now being threatened with unlimited fines for such discharge. Don't you think you need to be a consultee to stop this continuous building without dealing with the appropriate weakness in infrastructure. And really the last part of the same question is how much lead and copper piping. I come from a village where it's existed for several thousand years. So some of our drains and what have you are based upon things that were built many hundreds of years ago and continue to be used because there isn't the money to do it. But how long before we're going to run out of the equipment to do the replacement, because the demand is so high from your college such as Thames that it will be cost ineffective to buy the equipment and the piping. Do you have any actual real time scales for meeting these requirements?
Okay, so just in terms, we'll go with the sewage outflow number question first. So we provide the event duration monitor data to the Environment Agency, and then that's published annually. The number that you quoted, I don't recognise. So I think we, if you log on to and get the data, I think it is lower than that number you've circulated. But I think what we'll do is we'll share the specific information afterwards. If we provide you that, then that would be good. Yeah, so that, yeah. So in the what we actually saw in the numbers is during the drought year we got a lot less discharges. Now there's still a lot of discharges, but a lot less than in a rainfall year. So when it rains, the CSOs operate more. Even in the dry year, we still had rainfall events, so the CSOs still operate. I guess on top of that, so I just want to mention the continuous discharges from wastewater treatment works. So there is also our wastewater treatment works. So across Yorkshire, we operate 631 or 2 wastewater treatment works. There's the big ones in Doncaster, places like Sandal, or in Thorn. You know, all the towns have them. They will discharge treated effluent continuously to the watercourses. So that's effluent that is compliant with the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, goes through several stages of physical and biological treatment before we discharge that to the watercourse. That's heavily monitored. Last year, Yorkshire Water were the sort of leading performer in the sector for treatment works compliance, and it's an area we take an awful lot of pride in. In terms of the statutory consultee, yes, I think it would be really helpful if we could help shape some of those plans for the future, and make sure that I guess what we want is a world where the infrastructure is able to support the development. We don't want a world where infrastructure lags development. We want to be seen as supporting economic growth, and so if being a statutory consultee enables that, I think that's a good place to be. In terms of the supply of equipment, so we are continually renewing old equipment with new equipment. We have a lead pipe replacement programme that is obviously aimed from a public health perspective from removing lead pipes and things like lead solder. There's an awful. I know there was a comment earlier about pumps that have been probably manufactured in the 1950s or older, and that we are having to retrospectively engineer components for those. There are situations like that occur for ourselves. We have asset standards and equipment standards. So when things do reach the end of their life, we will replace them with a modern equivalent, which is, I guess, that's easier done on things like pumps, gearboxes, motors, harder to do on things like culverts and drains that continue to perform the function hundreds of years after they were created. So yeah, hopefully that's a flavour for it. If there's any more specifics, we can talk about that after as well, if you'd like.
Thank you very much, and thank you for partners for sitting here. It's been a long, eventful morning and now lunchtime as well. Conscious of time of where we are, and I know we want to do kind of a couple of questions asking all of you together. So if I'm going to suggest us take the first 3 questions in the question pack, and then maybe any last 2 questions, and then final comments from yourselves maybe, so to round it up. So Councillor James Church, you've got the first question to all authorities.
Right. How do authorities coordinate with other agencies during flood events to ensure road safety and minimise disruption, please?
Yeah, I can sort of explain the structure and how partners work together. So the Civil Contingencies Act establishes local resilience forums, which are based on police areas. So we're part of the South Yorkshire LRF. Within the LRF, it's made up of multi-agency partners, which are Category 1 and 2 responders, and you've got voluntary agencies and some of the partners that are here today. So when you've got a major incident or you're building up to a major incident, the strategic group would meet, and their responsibility is for managing the overall incident, deciding on the strategy, so how it's going to be managed, making sure the resources and the finance are available if needed, and coordinating at a regional level. So the strategy then would feed down to the tactical coordinating group. Generally, we hold that locally in Doncaster. And again, it's multi-agency. They have the responsibility of coordinating the tactical plan, coordinating resources, and we do that as a hybrid meeting, so it can be colleagues that are both in the emergency control room, and partners can dial in remotely as well.
Can you give you a bit of a practical example? So if we, in October when it starts raining, it's fair to say we're all pretty alert. We're all pretty alert to it. So there's an awful lot of us who work together to look at forecasts and predictions, and nature's not easy to predict or manage, but we're accustomed to this now. Then what we have within emergency planning and civil contingency is a structural framework for how we will deal with that, depending on the nature of the event. What happens at a very operational level, and to go back to the point of how do you make sure others are involved, there's 2 things. When we're in the height of an event, in the run-up to it or during it, we will meet frequently at all hours. But we will also have people out and about. We'll have forward liaison officers out and about working through 24 hours, 48 hours. Those calls, when we get together multi-agency, whether or not they're in person or via Teams or a mixture, will involve other agencies like fire and rescue. They will involve the police. They will, if necessary, involve the armed forces, because the armed forces can be an integral part of this in terms of what they can do to assist us. And also wider, like NHS partners, in relation to things like vulnerability, etc. But to back that up, we also have people out and about, because invariably what you may find is sometimes a disconnect between what may be discussed at the table at an operational level and what's actually happening on the ground. The best part of that is actually the data that comes from people who are out and about, because what you tend to find is that's the most useful element of the practical data when you're actually in the thick of it in a major flooding incident. So I think what we've done over time, I didn't start here till late 2020, we have evolved that partnership, we've evolved that network, it's got stronger. There are still some challenges when you're in the thick of it or in the fog of war, but I think generally we work reasonably well together. There have been some challenges on occasions around highway management, particularly in relation to road closures and being able to actively enforce that. Because what you need to remember is when we are out delivering 38,000 sandbags over a short period of time, that puts a pressure on the number of people I have available to do other things. And we have got particular spots where we do have challenges in relation to road closures, and sadly some people kind of, even when we do close roads, ignore that and take a decision to go through it.
Thank you. That's my question. How are current flood risk management strategies being adapted to account for the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events due to climate change? I know we just discussed some of it through your presentations, but how are you working collaboratively on this?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think obviously I'd be repeating quite a lot of what's already been said, particularly by Adam on the Connected by Water partnership. Obviously that's been key since 2019, and that's really brought us all together to look at strategically across the catchment what we can do and move away from simply building walls higher and higher, which it isn't always going to necessarily work. But obviously, like you said, the reality is that we are getting wetter winters, and so we're at the point where we do all need to work more closely together. And I think Connected by Water and the support that's been given from the chief executives in the past few weeks really shows that that's a good route to go down. I think also I mentioned earlier there's the Humber strategy, which has been going on for a number of years. Which is, so we're obviously looking at how we sort of reduce the peak flow coming from the top of the catchment down. But obviously what is harder to understand when you're living so far inland is the effect that the sea can have if it does get funneled up the Don. I'm not on the Humber strategy team, and they're working all the time to come up with ideas and progress solutions there as well. So we can link you in with their website, because everything's on there where you can learn about everything to do with the Humber strategy, and there's representation from Yorkshire Water on Humber strategy, and obviously Doncaster and the IDB on that as well. So again, it's a case of working together, and that's on the sort of bigger, longer term pieces of work. But obviously we can't wait till those are finished, and they won't necessarily have all the answers. So like I mentioned before, what we need to understand is the assets, as we've said, have been built over numerous years. They are starting to come to the end of their what we would have called design life, but because of the increased water being loaded on them, we are seeing an increased amount of sort of almost reactive maintenance required, which isn't where we want to be. So we've got a plan to basically identify, sort of get ahead of the game on it, so we can almost look at, instead of waiting to see where a visual inspection might identify where a piece of work is required, try and get an understanding of a future look to see where that could happen based on the material that asset's made up of, or even just the geometry of that particular asset. And obviously as part of that we'll be able to prioritise where works are required, how much they're going to cost, and where that funding could potentially come from. And then above all of this is obviously the national FCRM strategy, which again Adam mentioned in his slides and feeds into Doncaster's local flood risk management strategy. So there's multiple different things going on, but what's important is that we are all working together, we're all pulling them together to make sure that flood risk for communities is minimised.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I've got Councillor Rob Dennis to ask a question.
Now I'm going to turn the published question on its head in a way and just ask that last half, because we've heard from multiple of the agencies today sort of the successful partnerships, in particular that Connected by Water. But what are the areas where there's lessons learned taken from partnerships, or if you want to be even more critical, what things have you not got quite right yet and do you want to expand on in the future?
And I can do it from our side. So things have progressed since 2019, but not everything's perfect. I think some of the areas where we can be better, and I think we talked about flood warnings and flood alerts earlier. The coordination of flood warnings at the time that they hit with communities, really we need to be engaged in that process so we're aware, because immediately what the community will turn to is, well, what do I need to do? Do I need to decant? Where's the position with the authority? So I think there's some learning from that. Going back from the experiences I had in early 20? I lose fog, in the fog war I lose the days, because I can only remember the most recent one. But there was was it 2021? February 2021. So in February 2021, there was learning there from consistency of people on some of the calls. I'm being honest. So if you've got, and the reality is you've got to think, we're all human, but when you're working 24 hours, 48 hours it's hard to maintain some of that consistency with people, and then the sharing of that knowledge, that's got much better, but we still have some challenges with and around that. I think some of the other difficulties that we do face, going back to some of the funding elements, is that we get capital, but we don't get revenue. And I know that's been mentioned previously. You can say, well, why is that a challenge? So in 2023, for Storm Babette, 3 days, highest rainfall for 100 and odd years. You know, levels because of the tidal flow in Fish Lake and another location comparable with 2019. That cost my budget £1 million to deal with that, in terms of some of the staffing, in terms of some of the resource, in some of the clean-up. And yet government said, you're not eligible for any relief because you were below the threshold because you only had 18 houses flooded. Never mind what it took me and our services and our team and the positive work across the partners to prevent it. But the approach from government was, well, you didn't have enough houses flooded to get any money back. So that is one thing I think that we need to look at, is the level of resources that are available and that are in some form of contingency for us. But I think communication, timely communication. The other problem, I think, where we're learning across the agencies is deployment. So we can wait and we can wait and we can wait, and then it happens, I think, sometimes. And this is, you know, in fairness to the community, they want to see sandbags. But if we sit back and we kind of say, well, we don't think it's going to happen, I think we need it sometimes to make a judgment based on a perception rather than necessarily some of the science behind it. Because if I was a resident who'd flooded on a regular basis, I'd feel much more confident if I knew I had sandbags, rather than if it was the local authority perhaps saying, well, we may wait a little bit longer. And then a couple of lessons I think where we could be better was on the picking back up of sandbags as well, which is a bit of a challenge for us. But the reality is we tend to do them in a locality basis. So we'll tend to do particular areas because it's quite resource intensive for us to just go to one house, then go to another. You know, we try to do streets and swathes and estates in a coordinated fashion. I don't know if colleagues want to comment further.
If I can just come in, yeah, thanks. I think there's two big challenges that are bigger than the partnerships that we operate, that really do need everyone to get behind and help. And I think we've probably talked about them a lot today. One's planning, so the approach and the standards for planning and making sure that houses that are built today are fit for the future time horizon that we're going to live in them for. And the other one, which is frustrating and difficult in every scheme we deliver, is the funding and then the regulatory cycles that we all operate in. So different pots of money are governed by different time period cycles. I think we looked a couple of weeks ago, it's not until 2050 something that all of those cycles will align. So we're permanently sort of fighting the tide of trying to beat the system to get money secured from a pot that might not be ready to release the money, and that just consumes time, and it's just non-productive time. So I think, you know, we each lobby for policies to improve and funding routes to become more streamlined around the outcomes that we're jointly trying to deliver. I think that's a challenge that is bigger than our partnership, and I know others across the country are engaged in similar discussions.
Yeah, I can come in from our point of view. I think we sort of, if we look at partnerships from an incident perspective, but also sort of peacetime perspective, and I think during an incident we have improved dramatically. I do think that we often need to revisit roles and responsibilities. You know, this not sort of a stay in your lane kind of thing, but it does start to sort of, the waters start to get muddied, if you like. So I think that that's something that we do need to improve. But when it comes to our multi-agency response, you know, we exercise that a lot. We talk to each other a lot. We've, you know, the local resilience forums are, you know, really at the key to that. We just need to sort of keep remembering about roles and responsibilities. In terms of peacetime, we've made huge improvements, I think. The one thing that will always work against our partnerships is differing priorities. So as a local authority and a council, I realise that you're far greater than my niche little world of flood risk, and that you are, that you've been pulled from lots of different priorities. So I think, if when we find that shared one, and so we've talked about partnerships around multiple beneficiaries. So flood risk may end up becoming something that's quite minor in terms of something that we all want to do collectively. Regeneration might be the reason for it, but we can't regenerate without, ensuring that we reduce flood risk. So that, I think, is the one thing that does work against us, is not having our alignment around priorities.
Thank you. And just conscious of time, I was going to say, well, I don't think we'll have any time for questions, but it has been very interesting. I am conscious of time. We're supposed to finish at 1 o'clock. It is 5 to, and we need to go for recommendations. The only thing because I'm conscious of comments, and we've had comments from all partners, do the internal drainage board want to ask and add a final comment to anything that's been said? Okay. Yeah. Okay. There's any questions, we'll get the email details from everyone here and forward it on. So moving on to recommendations. So there are 3 recommendations, and there's possibility we might want to add some more following today's discussions. The first one is the collaboration between flood risk management authorities to be enhanced, to leverage collective expertise and resources. I think that's come out naturally today, and also maybe looking at discussion around funding as well is probably one opportunity to add onto there. The second one is specific measures to be implemented in identified high-risk areas to mitigate flood risks effectively. I wonder, I was added this as additional, but I wonder if it's worth putting it into that about reviewing the kind of, which came up from the earlier discussions about the infrastructure and assets we've got, whether that would fit nicely into there as well, but to identify if there are high risks from those infrastructures there. And thirdly, we've got the community engagement and awareness programmes to be expanded to ensure that citizens are well prepared for flood events. I've also added on there as well as additional is look at review, and again that might be going back to point 1, is look at the statutory consulting, whether obviously there is legal national ones, but whether we can do something internally with us to improve who we consult with regards to planning. Some of that discussion will come out, I think, when we meet separately, and probably look at having regular meetings with the drainage board partners, particularly with the online meeting next. But again, that was something that came out from yourselves at Yorkshire Water, so something we can have further discussion on. Is that sound like a recommendation for you? I've added some that has been on the report. Yes.
We'll just add the other drainage boards, Black Drain and Daneham as well.
Yeah, we'll do when we have the online meeting, then we can get further in depth on that one, and then we'll get further information, and we can also add that as a recommendation. Is there any other recommendations that the panel want to add, or does that sound reasonable for the additional ones as well? Okay, let me pass that. Okay. I will close that part of the meeting there. Thank you very much, partners. I know it's been a long meeting, but it's been very informative, and I hope you found it informative as well. We're just going to finish one point of the meeting quickly, but if you can stay behind, if you want to leave your details, that would be great, particularly as those who've said have promised information. Moving on to point 9 of the agenda, we've got the overview scrutiny work plan for 2024-25 and the council's forward plan of key decision. It should be attached to your pack. There will be some additional dates being put in the next week once a couple of member services officers return, regards to the road safety and also race management in the new year as well, so just to make you aware of that. Okay, any other comments on the work plan? Okay, I then formally close the meeting. Thank you very much for your involvement in this meeting.